Ja, jeg vil bare lige byde jer velkommen og godmorgen, og tak fordi I har lyst til at komme og deltage i vores lille event. Det er jo første gang, vi sådan prøver at stable lidt større ting på benene, og Kim har været sådan god tovholder af det hele. Men det er dejligt at se så mange. Og lige om lidt, så vil Kim lige kort introducere, hvad der skal ske i løbet af dagen med programmet og så videre, og de forskellige taler. Og hvis I har noget generelt spørgsmål om alt fra hvor er toilettet til et godt tilbud, så er vi en masse på kontoret i dag. Men Kim får lige lov at fortælle, hvad der sker i løbet af dagen.
Ja, velkommen til. Camera Lens Day. Og Lens Day betyder jo, at vi kommer til at tale en del om objektiver også, og heldigvis for det, fordi kamera og objektivet skal også være i orden. Det er ikke nok, at kameraet er i orden. Dem vi skal byde velkommen til, det er for det første Alister Chapman, som jo på vegne af Sony kommer og fortæller om, ja, han står jo med FX6, men reelt handler det jo om FX3, FX6, FX9 og så videre. Og så kommer Claus Rosenløv, som er et eller andet, han sidder hernede og fortæller lidt specielt om Sony-objektiver. Fortæller lidt om, hvad du har lavet, Claus, af forskellige produktioner, og hvorfor du har valgt de objektiver, du har valgt. Og lidt senere på dagen kommer Richard Larsen, som er fra Sigma, står nede bagi. Og han kommer så og fortæller selvfølgelig om Sigma-objektiver. Hvad er forskellen på et fotoobjektiv og et Cine-objektiv? Hvad er forskellen på Cine-objektiverne? Hvad er det for nogle look, man kan finde i forskellige typer objektiver, og så fremdeles? Det er der mange, der har ønsket, og jeg synes, det er rimelig interessant, så jeg håber, at I får rigtig meget ud af det også. Udover de tre talere, så finder vi også Louis Beckmann fra 25 Hour, som står derude med et Kinefinity-kamera, og det nye Sony ILME-FX6 objektiver står lige herude. Vi har de to fra Sony, Kenneth og Claus, står derovre med alle deres nye objektiver, hvis der er noget, I vil vide om Sonys nye objektiver. Så har vi Henrik Heise fra Focus Nordic, og Focus Nordic er et firma, som reelt er agent for Tokina, Sorui, Samyang og en del flere ting, altså for hele Skandinavien. Og det er dem, som alle forhandlerne rundt omkring så handler med, så det er sådan et stort lager, vi har. Og så render vi rundt i sådan nogle sorte hættetrøjer her, og det er alle dem, som arbejder i firmaet her. Og vi har også en del inde i vores udlejning. Hvis der er nogen, der ikke kender vores udlejning, er velkommen til at gå derind og kigge og se, hvad de kan gøre. Men ellers så håber jeg, at vi får en god dag, og så vil jeg byde jer velkommen en gang til og sige Alister Chapman, it's yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kim. Right, so I'm not going to necessarily just be going through certain cameras at certain times. So I thought the first thing that I would try and do is to try and figure out what it is that you have all come here today for, because it's definitely not a beauty contest or anything like that that's going on here. So you must have come here for cameras, and you must have come here to learn something about cameras. So it'd be really good if I could understand what it is that you're here to learn about. So we're going to do a quick show of hands and try and figure out what it is that you guys want to learn. So who here has come here for information on the FX9? Quite a few, yeah, okay. FX6, a lot more. FX3, FX30, FR7. Well, there is an FR7 out there if you do want to. Okay, so mostly FX6, but a fair amount of FX9 and a little bit of FX3. So how many of you shoot with S-Log3 or Log, Cine EI? Okay, probably the most. S-Cinetone? Okay, who uses autofocus? Can't be honest. Who doesn't use autofocus? Okay, That's fair enough. Not many now. It's amazing how that's changed over a period of maybe 2 years. 2 years ago, you did the same thing. Who doesn't use autofocus? And almost everybody would put their hand up. Now everyone seems quite happy to admit, well, actually, I do use it because it does help me. Okay, so a bit of everything, it would seem. Now, something that is really, really, really important. There are no stupid questions, and please, please, please ask questions, because that way I can explain things that I haven't explained very well better. If I've said something and you're sitting there going, what the f is he talking about? It probably means I didn't explain it very well, and I can bet that you won't be the only person in the room going, what the fuck is he talking about? So please, that's a really good point to go, Alister or Oi, could you explain that again? I really don't mind. You know, it's just, no, it's much better if everybody actually understands and leaves here learnt something rather than leaving here even more confused than you might be now. So do ask those questions. And generally, I did an event a couple of weeks ago, and we had lots and lots of questions. And it was a bit of a shame we didn't get to cover everything that I had planned to cover in that event. But then we covered the stuff that we did really well. And I think really everyone got a lot out of that session. So, you know, so do ask those questions, because otherwise I can waffle on. I've got about 10,000 PowerPoint slides I can just keep going through. So, having said all of that, right, if we could bring the camera output up on the tip, fantastic, look at that, mind reader. So, following from a conversation I just had outside, rather than diving into PowerPoint slides, I'm going to take a look at autofocus on, I've got the FX6 here in front of me, but it's broadly similar on the FX9, FX3, FX30, etc. While I think about it, because it seems to be a little bit of confusion about a couple of things. So if I go into the camera's autofocus settings here, we have lots and lots of settings. Now, something about autofocus is it's not as intelligent as I would like to think that I am. I'd like to think that I am more intelligent than my camera. So in terms of autofocus, it's just going to do what it thinks is right. And that's not necessarily what we want. So learning to use the autofocus and using the autofocus, it's not as simple as just turning it on and using the same settings for every single shot, because it's not always going to work the way you want it to. Starting at the top here, transition speed. This is how quickly the camera will change focus position. So let me just take this out of locked on and just put this in responsive for a minute. So if I set this to fast and just come out, it should quite quickly follow my hand as I move my hand to and from the camera, and it will stay in focus. And that's great if you're filming racing cars, if you're filming anything that's moving really quickly, if you're on a gimbal and moving around a lot and all of those sorts of things, you might want the autofocus to be really fast. There is an issue with that, though, is that not only does the focus move quickly, but if the camera refocuses for any reason, it does it very quickly. And every now and again, you will get moments where the camera, for some reason, might think, oh, am I in focus? And it will check. And what happens when you've got your focus adjustment speed set to very fast, if you look at the background, is you'll see very big, but you don't see my hand changing much, but can you see how the background's changing? So, oh, and there we go, it's completely confused. And what happens is, if you're doing an interview and somebody leans in, so if that person is here and they lean into your shot more, what you see, if you look at the bottom of the chart, as I move my hand backwards and forwards, you see that big change in the background. You don't see my hand change, and in a wider shot in particular, and where you've got a deeper depth of field, so if that background is further away, that background is going to change massively as that person in your interview just rocks forwards and backwards. And that can look really nasty in your shots. Now, of course, if you were manually focusing, that wouldn't happen, because the person would lean forwards and you'd probably wait a moment to see if they're going to lean back before you change focus. You're not going to try and track every minute move of the person, but the autofocus will if you've got it set to fast. So you really want to slow that down, especially in interviews and things like that, because you're not going to see that change on them, but you'll see it happening in the background. Because these lenses can refocus really, really fast. And if someone just momentarily just sort of ducks in and out like that, and your background goes bloop, bloop, it looks really nasty. So one of the things you want to change, for interviews in particular, is to slow this right down. And then in that sort of similar scenario, because you have to wait for the camera to now focus, when the person does that, we don't see the background change. And that will make your interviews and things like that much more natural. It'll make it look as though you're perhaps focusing by hand. Oh, wrong menu. And then the next one we have here is the shift sensitivity. And this goes from responsive to locked on. So when it's set to responsive and I bring my hand in fairly quickly, it will change to focusing on my hand. As soon as I take my hand out, it will refocus on the chart. Now, again, we're in that very slow setting. So let's go for a really worst case scenario. You'd probably only ever really use this for something like motor racing, because it's just going to snap in and out of focus almost instantly and very quickly. Now, so this is responsive. As soon as something changes in your shot, the camera will refocus. The other extreme is locked on, and now I can do that, and the camera isn't going to refocus. It's for about 30 seconds because it's locked on, and it had already focused on the chart. Eventually, it will give up, and it will focus on my hand. Eventually. All right, we could be waiting a while. Or I could just, as we've got focus assist on this lens, I can just turn the focus ring and use the focus assist. And now it'll stay there, it won't move. So when you have locked, and then suddenly it goes. So when you have locked on set, that really, again, for interviews and things like that, it's going to really help you. So you want locked on with, probably with a slow transition speed. So I'm going to put these both in the middle ground now. And the other thing I want to have a look at is this setting here in particular, which is face and eye priority autofocus. So we can choose between face and eye only, face and eye priority, and off. Now in off, the autofocus will just focus on whatever is the largest thing in the scene, in the shot. If I fill the shot with my hand, it will focus on my hand. But if I set this to face and eye only, because my hand isn't a face, it's going to ignore my hand. It's not going to focus on my hand. It will only focus on the picture of the girls, because that's faces. If I defocus it completely with the AF assist, it should eventually realize that that's out of focus. No, the AF assist is going to stay there. Let me bring it in close, and then the autofocus will take over. You see, I'm just defocusing a little bit, and the autofocus is taking over. But it won't focus on my hand because it's not a face, because it's faces and eyes only. And then we have face and eye priority, which prioritizes faces and eyes. So when the camera can see faces and eyes, it will focus on them. But if it can't see any faces or eyes, it will focus on something else. As soon as I reveal a face, it's going to have to be a face looking at the camera will prioritize that face until there are no faces, and then it will focus on anything. So that's face priority. Now, if I go to face and eye only, now one of the things that we have on top of this is the ability to focus on a particular face. Now, I've got a little yellow bar underneath the eyes here. I can move this with the thumbstick, and I can select a face. So if I select this face here, put the yellow bar underneath it, press the select button, and the camera will focus on that face. Now, top left of the viewfinder, you'll see that little symbol. You see the person with the brackets around their head. That's saying that it's face only, but there's no asterisk, there's no star there. And actually that's because this girl And in fact, with pictures, the face focus doesn't work as well as it could. And because that girl, the blonde girl, is not looking directly at the camera can't actually recognize her face. Now, it's selected it, and if I move, it will try and track it, but you can see it's now jumped to the other girl's face. Now, watch what happens if I choose her face. So I'm going to select the darker colored girl's face. If you look top left now, we have a star next to the face symbol. Top left corner of the viewfinder, we have a star. If I select the blonde girl's face, no star. And that's because the camera isn't able to actually recognize that girl's face for some reason in this picture. In fact, in this picture, it doesn't recognize that face either. In this picture, the only face it actually recognizes is that one, and then I get a star. And the difference here now is the camera will only focus on her face. Doesn't matter what else we do. If I take her face out of the shot, I get an exclamation mark. And the camera is saying, I can't see her. Where is she? As soon as I bring her face back into the shot, it will focus on her face. It won't focus on any of the other girls. It will always come back to her face, because we've got that star symbol that tells me that that particular face and no other face is recognized. Now, if I select this face, we don't have the star symbol. Pan off, she's walked out of the shot or whatever, I will get the exclamation mark again. There are no faces. Come back into the shot, and the camera's now picked the dark-colored girl's face because it didn't recognize the face when I selected it. So that's an important differentiation in this mode, is if the camera has actually been able to identify the individual face, then you get the star symbol. But if it's not able to identify the individual face, you don't. And I'm not sure exactly why some faces work and some don't. It's just the way it is. If I quickly pan the camera around and embarrass somebody hugely here, and we pick that face, nope. No, it's probably because their profile looking at the camera, it's probably a bit too dark. No. Here we go. It doesn't like anybody here. No, sorry. But at least now you know the difference between these different settings. Because I think a lot of people, they'll go into a situation, they might select this face here, and because it's got the double box around the eye or the face, let's use that one there, they think that that face has been identified and recognized, but it hasn't. It's only been recognized if you actually get that asterisk. So when you're doing an interview or something like that, and most normal faces that are lit properly and everything else, the camera will actually correctly identify and actually you can actually remember it. But if you haven't got that star symbol, that face, that individual face isn't recognized. So when that face goes to and from the shot, the camera's not necessarily going to focus on it, and it's decided that something back there looks like a face. That's really weird. There, it's gone for the darker coloured girl again. There's obviously something that the camera likes about her face. So you really do need to make sure that you understand the difference between not having that star symbol and having it. I think a lot of people aren't aware of that subtlety of the autofocus and the way it works. So going back into the autofocus menu, which do you choose? I mean, generally, if I'm doing an interview, I'll use Face Eye Only AF. If I'm, again, we'll have the shift sensitivity down to locked on. If the camera is, if I don't want it to change, don't want it to move, and I'll have the focus set quite slow. And set like that, it's extremely unusual for the camera to ever try and refocus or change focus when you're doing an interview or filming an individual person. The other thing you might want to think about as well is using the zone instead of wide. And of course, you can move that zone. So if your interviewee is on that side of the frame, it just helps isolate that part of the frame. Something to be aware of. So if I do put the zone over here on this side, is that the face tracking, you see we've still got the face boxes over the girls, they're not actually in the autofocus zone. And I could actually select a face over there. Let's select the dark colored girl. Her face is recognized. Let me deliberately defocus the shot, not so much that she can't be seen at all. The camera isn't going to focus on her because she's not in the AF zone. So you'll still get the face tracking boxes to say, oh, I can see a face, but because it isn't in the focus zone, the camera won't focus on it, and it won't focus on it until it comes into the zone. And because I use the AF assist, here we go. So if I defocus that slightly, the camera's going to bring it back in. This is the focus assist. But if I do the same when she's not, when the faces aren't in the zone, nothing happens. When they come into the zone, they come into focus. So the AF will only function within the zone that you've chosen, even though it's still going to recognize faces outside of the zone. So that's another one of those little gotchas, perhaps, that isn't terribly well communicated. And if you go down to flexible spot, it's even smaller. I mean, with flexible spot, the focus is only going to function within that little box. So if I defocus this a little bit, it's not going to come into focus until, because it's on face only, we bring a face into the box. Come on, you can do it. That's because I've been overriding it with the AF assist. But if I take it out of focus, the camera brings it back in while it's in the box each time. But if they're not in the box, the camera won't bring them back into focus. Then they're back in the box, comes back into focus. So it's important to understand that although the face boxes operate over the entire frame, the camera will only actually focus on whatever is inside your chosen zone. Let's go back to wide. Okay, so, and that's broadly the same behavior on FX9, FX3, etc. And of course we have touch tracking as well, so I can just touch where I want to focus. And again, we can see when I touched on her face, I get the star symbol because it's recognizing her face. If I touch on that face, I don't. We get this same behavior. Okay, so let me just take that out of face only. So are we all clear on that, how that all works? Good. Okay, so I tell you, I'm going to mix this up a little bit and jumble this around a little bit and jump in and out of different things just to try and keep things interesting. So some of you that perhaps follow my Facebook page and everything may have seen this video that I just did fairly recently, posted it yesterday actually, which is on the new Sony FX30, which is this camera here. I'm not going to show you the whole video. That camera there, Sony's FX30, looks just like an FX3. And this is the new camera from Sony. This is an APS-C sized sensor, which is more or less the same as Super 35. It's a 6K sensor. Camera only records in 4K. There's no 6K recording. Even with the RAW, it's 4K. And I really, really like this little camera. It's a really good performer in terms of dynamic range. Let's have a look. I've got some tables and charts here. I compared the FX6, FS7 and the FX30. And if we look at these two charts here, this is the 30 on the left and the 6 on the right in terms of dynamic range. I really, really struggled to find any difference at all. Possibly, dare I say it, the FX30 has more dynamic range than the FX3 or the FX6, which is quite a surprise. The chart that I've got, the little test device that I have, isn't super accurate, but it does allow you to compare two cameras and understand what's going on with their dynamic range. And certainly, Sony say the FX30 is 14 plus stops, and the FX6 is 15 plus stops. There is a 15th stop that you can see deep in the noise, but I would actually say that they're both the same, or at least very, very similar in terms of dynamic range. In terms of color, They pretty much look identical. There is a very, very minor difference. It's hard to see in this shot, but between the male mannequin, the FX6 is a touch warmer than the FX30. I did quite a lot to try and get the white balances to match and make sure everything wasn't a white balance issue and things like that. But there is a very, very, very slight difference. If you were doing a 2-camera shoot with 2 different camera angles, if your FX30 was a B camera to an FX6, you'd never ever spot that. Certainly your audience wouldn't. They'd just see 2 different camera angles. So it's not something that I'm concerned about or worried about. I would be quite happy to match these 2 cameras, different scenes, different locations, different shots. Nobody's going to realize that there's that small a difference between them. So in terms of color and everything else, they match really well. The same in log. There's that same very slight difference exists. If you're thinking about, if you're currently an FS7 owner, perhaps, and we look at the difference between the FX30 and the FS7, if you actually look at the color of the girl's hair, it's slightly orange on the FS7 and red on the FX30. And this is because the previous generations of cameras, the sensors were much more sensitive to infrared light than this generation. So Sony used to have to use a fairly strong infrared filter in the optical path. And what happens when you do that is it's inevitable that that infrared filter is going to cut off a little bit of the red light that hits the sensor. So in terms of the red response of the sensor, it's reduced by that infrared filter. And that causes the camera to reproduce reds less well than it should do. There's gain added in the camera to make up for it. And that's what we're seeing here, is we're seeing that red hair from the FS7 not being as well represented as it actually is. It really is this sort of scarlet color. Whereas the new cameras, the infrared filtering and everything else is much, much better. The red response is better. And this has an impact on skin tones because red is a very important part of skin tones. If you look at anybody's face, they'll have blotches of red and patches of red and things like that. So with the new cameras, the better red response really does help reproducing skin tones on real people and things like that. So this is a really nice thing. So FX30, really good performer. And in terms of noise, so this is FS7 versus the FX30. And I used to talk a lot about, with the previous generation of cameras, needing to expose them a bit brighter than Sony recommend, when you're shooting log in particular. And that was because the FS7 and the previous generations of cameras are noisy. And they have this nasty colored noise. You can see all the flecks of red and green in the previous generation of cameras' output. And if you shot something in low light or where the light wasn't brilliant, in terms of dynamic range, actually, the FS7 is actually surprisingly good. It does hold its own against these cameras. But because there's so much of this colored noise in the shadows, it looks really nasty if you're even remotely or slightly underexposed. So most people tend to shoot with them a bit brighter, maybe 1.5 stops brighter than Sony recommends, so you don't have these nasty colored splotches and blotches in your footage. With the new cameras, you just don't need to expose them as brightly because there is still noise. They don't have zero noise. No camera has zero noise, but the noise is not unpleasant. It just looks more like a gentle grain. So this is one of the things that, if I really play that, you can really see range. So if you're how much more FS7, obvious the noise in the FS7 is. And this has been blown up. This is magnified about 5 times, this image. So you are seeing the noise, but you can see that's why the previous generations of cameras really benefited from being exposed a bit more brightly than these new generations do. Resolution. If we look at these 2 charts here, it's a little bit difficult to see, but the FX30 actually, where I've got side by side somewhere. The FX30 resolves better than the FX3 does, dare I say, or the FX6 as well. If we look at this chart, where you get these patterns in here, This is aliasing, and this is actually something it's false detail. It's not real picture information. It's an interference pattern that's generated because the sensor doesn't have high enough resolution, or the optical filtering isn't strong enough. And the limit of the resolution of the FX6 is about here on this particular test pattern. The FX30 keeps going beyond that down to about here before you start getting the aliasing patterns. I don't know exactly what that is. I couldn't give you a value. It's just the FX6 resolves a little bit more than the FX30 resolves a little bit more than the FX6 or FX3, and that's because it's got a 6K sensor. And that really helps it with aliasing and moire and things like that. So it's a really nice, well-configured camera, and does really, really well. So if you're in the budget or in the market for a B camera, FX30 definitely gets my vote. It's Super 35 only, it doesn't do full frame. But then, don't get me wrong here, I like full frame, and I shoot with full frame. I have an FX6, I have the FX9, I shoot with Venice, and I do a lot of full frame shooting. But I'm not going to say fad, that's a bit too strong a word, too severe. But I think full frame perhaps isn't always the right tool for everything. So it's really nice when you have a camera like the FX9 where you can switch between full frame and Super 35. And FX9, don't forget, the FX9, because that's a 6K full frame sensor, is just as good at Super 35 4K as the FS7 or any of the Super 35 4K cameras that came before were, if not better, because it's got the better color science, lower noise, and all those other things. So the FX9 is a very, very capable Super 35 camera. And I actually really have enjoyed going back to Super 35 and using smaller, lighter lenses again. It's very, very difficult to get big zoom range parfocal lenses for full frame. It's just the laws of physics are against you. If you're trying to put the same amount of light on a bigger sensor, the front element of the lens needs to be much bigger, and to make that front element of the lens much bigger is much more expensive. And if your whole optical design is designed around a parfocal zoom, that's an incredibly expensive lens to make for full frame. Much cheaper to scale it down to Super 35. So with the FX30, this lens that I have on that one there, it's the Sony 18 to 105 millimeter f4, almost parfocal lens. With autofocus, you can zoom in and out quite comfortably with it. Power zoom, and the whole package is so small, so light, so portable, and that lens is about 500 euros. The camera is about 2,000 euros. And it's a really nice little combination, nice little package. Would I swap it for my FX6? No, I wouldn't. No SDI out, it's HDMI only. With the FX3 and the FX30, there are, I don't want to use issues, but if you're monitoring and you take the HDMI out to a monitor, you then lose your live feed on the LCD when you're recording, and a few things like that. So there's various restrictions that mean you probably don't want it to be your main camera in a professional type of shoot. Having SDI out, having HDMI at the same time, not losing the viewfinder image, waveform displays, all of those things make the FX6 a much better professional tool as your main camera. But certainly as a secondary camera, or where you need to be super portable, FX30, I really can't recommend it strongly enough. Okay, so let's come back to the FX6. Another area where there is some confusion is dual ISO and dual sensitivity and dual base ISO. So the FX30 and the FX9 and Sony's Venice cameras, they are what Sony call dual base ISO. So the FX30, FX9 and Venice, between their upper and lower base ISOs, there is virtually no difference in noise, virtually no difference in dynamic range. In fact, I've not ever been able to measure any difference in dynamic range. Color response is the same. So the two base ISOs on the FX9, Venice and FX30, are pretty close to interchangeable. There is more noise on the high base on all of them, but it's a very minor difference. The FX30 is 800 ISO and 2500 ISO. There's definitely more noise at the higher base in the FX30. The FX9 is 800 and 4000. And there's a little bit more noise, but not a lot. The FX6 and the FX3, though, are slightly different. And Sony don't call them dual base ISO. They call them dual sensitivity or dual range, or they will say it has two base ISOs, but they don't ever call it dual base ISO. And the reason for that is that the FX6 is considerably more noisy at the high base ISO of 12,800 than it is at 800. But we have to put this into some perspective, that going from 800 ISO to 12,800 is, how many dB is that? So if every time you double the ISO, you are adding 6 dB of gain. So 1600 is 6 dB, 3200 is 12, 6400 is 18, and then 12,800 is 24 dB of gain. Anybody that's ever used a traditional camera where the gain is in dB will know that if you put 24 dB of gain in, that's probably unusable, almost certainly. So to be able to go from 800 to 12,800 and actually only have this little amount of extra noise is quite remarkable. But they don't call it dual ISO because of that certainly visible and noticeable noise difference. It's definitely there in the footage. You can't ever pretend that they are the same. So it is different to the other cameras in that regard. FX3 behaves more or less the same. So what I find is that at high base ISO, shooting in log, I tend to use 6400 EI or 3200 EI so that I'm exposing a bit more brightly. Then in post-production, I bring my footage down, and then that extra noise, it doesn't ever go away, but it certainly becomes far, far less visible. And in terms of low light and shooting in very dark environments, the FX6 and the FX3, A7S3 as well, in my view, really do remain the kings of low light. It's really going to be hard to find another camera that does better, because another factor with all of this is something called photon shot noise, which is the randomness that exists in light itself. So light isn't entirely uniform. Some of the photons that reflected and bounce off an object, some of them, I'm trying to find the right words to describe this, some bounce better than others. So that the light that we see and the way certain objects emit light isn't entirely uniform. So there is noise in light itself. When you have a huge amount of light, that randomness is a very small percentage of the light, so you don't normally see it. It's something you very, very rarely see. But when you've only got a very small amount of light, that randomness in the light becomes a much larger percentage of the light itself, so you will, or at least your camera, will start to see it. And some of this noise that we see at 12,800 ISO isn't actually electronic noise. Some of that is noise that's in light itself. If you've ever seen footage from an image intensifier, you know, the green things that you see on TV, it's always sparkly and noisy and grainy. And that isn't so much something that an image intensifier is adding. That's actually because the light that image intensifier is seeing is really, really noisy. And that's why the images look like that. And even if you could make a perfect zero noise image intensifier, the pictures would still look noisy because the light at those sorts of levels is very, very noisy. So some of this noise is actually just the randomness that occurs in light anyway. And this is going to be quite an interesting area where we are right now. Is yes, we can make cameras more and more sensitive, but noise will never ever go away because we're now capturing the noise in light itself. One thing you can do to mitigate this noise is a longer exposure, because the more light you capture, that randomness gets averaged out the longer you can capture for. So when we get up to 12,800 ISO, and I don't know if anyone's actually looked at this, I'm not sure if it won't be easy to show this on this screen, but if you use a very fast shutter speed, the pictures get noisier. And that's because you're capturing not just less light in each frame, so the randomness that's in the light becomes a more significant part of the light. So if you start shooting at high base ISO, and you're shooting 120 frames per second and using 180-degree shutter, that's going to be noisy. It's really going to be noisy. Short shutter speed, high sensitivity, very little light going onto the sensor. There will be lots of photon shot noise. If you go to a 360-degree shutter, the noise will halve. Just the shot noise itself will halve, and you'll have more light going onto the sensor anyway, so you'll have less noise just generally because you'll be a brighter exposure. So it's something to think about when you're thinking about shutter speeds and high frame rates and things like that, is especially when you're going to very high sensitivities, that very short shutter speeds will give you noisier pictures than longer shutter speeds. And that's not something a lot of us have had to think about previously, because it's something that wasn't a problem because cameras weren't sensitive enough. I go up to Norway every year, top of Norway, and I shoot the Northern Lights. And the Northern Lights, anyone, how many of you have seen the Northern Lights? I'm curious. Quite a few. You'll know that most of the time they're not actually very bright. They're quite, I think a lot of people, they see the videos on my videos, perhaps other people's videos, and think, oh, wow, it's amazing. And they go up to Norway, and if it's an ordinary, average Northern Lights display, it's like, is that it? It's like, shouldn't it be brighter than that? And I'm like, no, that's it. Or they'll come out of their hotel and they'll look up the sky and they can't see anything. And the Northern Lights are there. They just have to wait half an hour for their eyes to adapt to the dark, and actually then they'll be able to see it. That's the kind of how bright they can be at times. Sometimes they do get very bright. Sometimes they'll get bright enough that they'll cast shadows and things like that, and it's really special when they're like that. But most of the time they're pretty faint. So that's when I take my FX6, I've taken the FX6, taken the FX3 as well, and A7S3, and those cameras really come into their own in those sorts of trying to capture very, very little light in those situations. And then you start using things like long exposures and slow shutter speeds. So something else, while I'm here, if we go into the shutter settings, if I can bring the camera up on the screen. We can, if I press and hold the shutter speed button, we see we've got some options here. We have speed, we have ECS, and obviously off. Shutter speed versus shutter angle. In terms of what the shutter does, they're both identical. There's no difference. It's shutter speed versus shutter angle in itself is not going to change your picture quality or the way it looks or anything like that. Shutter angle is a holdover from when we used to use film cameras, and in between each frame, you've got to move the film on to the next frame. And I don't know how many of you actually have seen the shutter in a film camera. Is generally, especially if you have a reflex film camera, so that's a film camera where the light comes in through the lens, is bounced off a mirror into the viewfinder. That mirror is actually on the back side of the shutter, and that's normally half of the shutter. The shutter's a rotating disc that spins around, and half of that disc is cut away to let light onto the film plane, and then the other half of that forms a mirror that reflects the light up into the viewfinder. And through half of that rotation period, half of 360 degrees is 180 degrees, through half of it the film is moved physically to the next frame, and then the shutter goes around and it's exposed again. So in film, 180-degree shutter was a necessary thing to be able to give us time to move the film on. It wasn't something that necessarily, I mean, I shot a lot of Super 16 back in the 1980s. It wasn't necessarily something we wanted. It was what we had, and that was it. And of course, if you changed your frame rate, the shutter speed would change because the shutter's spinning faster. So it wasn't necessarily a good thing. And back then, I would have probably killed to have had a camera, because I had a Arri ST, and that didn't have a variable shutter. It was 180 degrees, and that was it. That's it. That's all you've got. I would have killed to have had different shutter speeds for different types of things when I'm shooting different things. It wasn't seen as being a good thing, always shooting at 180 degrees. It's just that's what the cameras did. Today, we have the ability to choose to use that method with angle if we want, and it's not a bad thing. What it means, if you change your frame rate, the shutter speed will always be half, or whatever angle you've chosen relative to your frame rate, so it varies with your frame rate. And that might be beneficial in some situations. Perhaps if you're shooting here in Europe at 25 frames per second this week and you want 1/50th shutter, 180 degree shutter gives you that, so you won't have any sync issues with any lights or lighting. And then maybe next week you fly off to America and you're shooting at 30 frames per second, 180 degree shutter will give you a 1/60th speed, which American mains is 60 hertz, keeps you in sync with all the lights and everything else, and that's great. But where you do get a problem is if you're shooting here at 24 frames per second and use a 1/48th shutter, 180 degree shutter. You're going to come across a lot of situations where your shutter will be out of sync with the 50 hertz mains frequency, out of sync with lights, out of sync with monitors, out of sync with all sorts of things. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you'll be at a 60th shutter, and again, you'll be out of sync with lighting and various things here. 1/60th, though, might get you in sync with a lot of computer monitors. You go to 120 frames per second, and I think this is where you really have to start thinking, do I actually really need a 180 degree shutter at 120 frames per second? Because if I was to show you two clips, one shot at 120 frames per second with a 360 degree shutter or shutter off, and then another shot at 120 with a 1/240th, 180 degree shutter, most of the time, most people wouldn't notice the difference between those two shots. Except if you're in low light, and if you're a 2/40th shutter, you're going to really struggle for light. So it's not something we always have to have, a 180 degree shutter. So do think about whether you really need it and whether it's really appropriate. A lot of people don't like using shutter speed because, oh, that's so video. But these are video cameras. Arri Alexa is a video camera. Red, the video cameras. Venice, it's a video camera. It is not a film camera. There is nowhere where in this camera I can feed a roll of film in it. So it's a video camera. I think we have to try and separate hype, for want of a better word, internet coolness versus practicality and reality. Shutter speed allows me to dial in an exact shutter speed. I know whether it will be in sync with my lights or not, or my monitors and all of those other things. We go to ECS. So this is our variable speed shutter, and now I can dial in all sorts of weird and wonderful shutter speeds. So I can find, if I'm shooting a computer monitor, if I've got a problem with lights where I've got dark bands or colored bands going across the picture. How many of you have seen colored bands going across the picture? A few of you. That's less spotted, but it does occur. And that can occur if you're using, actually, that can occur if you're using really good video lights, but the two different brands or two different manufacturers' video lights. So proper video lights tend to flash at a very high rate. And generally you don't have any control over that. It'll be something like 20 kilohertz. It's a very, very high rate. With a single light pointing at your scene, you shouldn't ever see any banding or anything like that. But one of the things we have to understand about video lights is they're not perfect. The spectrum that video lights output, if you've ever looked at the spectrum of even a very high quality video light, is not perfect. There'll be peaks and troughs in the spectrum. And one light might have a little bit more red than another light might have a little bit more green. And our video cameras aren't like our own vision. So our own vision is very good at automatically nulling out those imperfections. We don't see it because our vision is adaptive. But the camera is not adaptive. The camera, you just white balance it. It sets a particular matrix up when it does that. And if that spectrum of that light doesn't tie in nicely with the color filters on the camera, the matrix settings, etc., you will see slightly odd colors sometimes. Now, where you can see this issue with colored bands is if you've got two different lights from two different brands, and one light might be slightly deficient in red and the other might be slightly deficient in blue. Now, individually, that's not a problem. You won't ever notice anything, perhaps. But when you've got two lights, one's got a bit of extra red, one's got a bit of extra green, and they're flashing on and off at different rates, sometimes some frames are going to have more of one light than the other in, or parts of that frame, because this is going really, really fast. So you'll actually have bands of color throughout the frame, depending on which light happened to flash at what point in your frame capture. And what you sometimes see is they're subtle. You might see a red, a slightly warm band, or a slightly blue band rolling through your shot very slowly. Tend to notice it most when you're shooting at higher frame rates, when you've got faster shutter speeds, because there's going to be fewer flashes in each frame. But it is something to watch out for if you're mixing lights from different brands or different types of light. So if you've got an LED light and a fluorescent light, or a very high frequency light and a lower frequency light, things like that. So it's just something to watch for. And the ECS in that situation may help you to dial it out by bringing the camera shutter into sync with the flash rate of the light. So we have ECS, and if I, didn't want that, press and hold the shutter button. If I go to speed, we have our shutter speed. We can go very, very fast. And we also have this F number. And this is frames. So this is what's called the slow shutter. So we can have a 1/25th at 25 frames per second. That's as slow as we can go. And then we have 2F. So that's 2 frames. So if I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, that's going to be 2 frames. So that's 1/12th of a second. If I go to 4F, I'm not going to try and do 3. That's going to be 1/6th of a second. If I go to 32 frames, that's just over a second. So that's 25 frames plus almost a half a second. It's almost a 1.5 second exposure. And we can go all the way to 64 frames, which is going to be 2.5 seconds. And this gives us a really, really slow, long exposure. And this you can combine with the time-lapse function, the interval record function on the camera, if you want those really blurry headlights in shots, because if I move this, it's going to be very blurry. Let's put 0.5 ton of ND in. It's on preset. So let's just dial in a load of ND. Wait for the camera to catch up. But if I move the camera now, we'll have that really sort of smeary, blurry car headlights type thing. So you can combine that with the interval record function to get those sort of nice blurring of headlights and cars going down the street. Or if you're in a shopping center and you want that sort of where the people are, that's like ghosts moving around in the foreground, you can use the slow shutter. You'll need a big, strong ND filter to do that. But you can use that in lots of creative ways. It's a really nice thing that the cameras have. So let's go back to a sensible shutter speed. It does take the camera a little while to catch up. So that's the shutter. FX3 doesn't have ECS. It does have slow shutter. You can go down to very slow shutter speeds on the FX3, but it doesn't have the ECS or a variable shutter. The FX30, interestingly, does have a variable shutter. And you can dial in pretty much whatever shutter speed you want. I think it's just slightly later hardware in the FX30 than the FX3. The FX30 can also stream as a web device, so you can actually stream in S-Cinetone, which is really nice. Nice little thing if you want to use it as a webcam. Okay, so how are we doing? Right, let's go to the Cine EI mode, because this is always an area where people perhaps get confused or don't really understand it. Let me see what I've got slide-wise I can bring up really quickly. Okay. So, the Cine EI mode, why does it exist? Why don't I use internal recording and crank up the gain? Because I can shoot log in custom mode. So let's have a look at that first of all. If I go back to the project settings, base settings, come out of Cine EI, go to custom mode. So I'm now in custom mode. We have a couple of different options here. We have SDR or HDR. So this is what display device am I using. This isn't really designed as a, oh, HDR, this must be better than capturing in 709. Well, it's not really, because if you're in the HDR mode, you can actually capture S-Log3 in the HDR mode. You can also capture HLG, hybrid log gamma. But what this is really doing is changing the monitoring output to be compatible with HLG, HDR TVs and monitors. If you do try and shoot this way, you'll have, I can almost guarantee you that you will have all sorts of, what are we doing here? 0 dB. Let me just, how's this camera been set up? Didn't want that. A decent exposure. The way this camera is set up, it's gone to high base ISO as well, is we're going to be shooting with the gamma curve currently called hybrid log gamma. Now, hybrid log gamma isn't the same as S-Log or most other log curves. It is a hybrid of Rec 709 and log. So the lower part of the curve, below about 70%, is essentially Rec 709. And then above 70%, we have this log-shaped gamma curve. And that's designed to be compatible with HDR TVs. And if you ever try to grade this, it's actually quite a challenge to grade it, because the highlights get compressed and it doesn't actually have that great a dynamic range. It's only about 10 stops. So compared to S-Log3, you don't have the dynamic range. It's really quite tricky to grade. It's not a way I would recommend shooting unless you're actually deliberately going to go directly to an HDR TV without any grading. The whole point of this is to be able to, is allowing you to capture something that is compatible with HDR. 10 stops, 11 if you're using HLG2, does give you more dynamic range than Rec 709, and that goes directly onto an HDR TV, and it will look like HDR. But in terms of capturing the best dynamic range or anything like that, no, this is not the way to do it. So this mode exists purely for that. If we go to 709 mode, and I'll leave the camera. It's gone to high base ISO automatically. The camera remembers which base ISO you were in the different modes. We have S-Cinetone, and that's a really nice curve. It captures about 11 stops of dynamic range. I suppose while I'm here, I could just talk a little bit about S-Cinetone. Let's just change this for a different chart. So S-Cinetone is designed to give you a really nice picture straight out of the camera that has good dynamic range, doesn't need to be graded, and works quite well. So let's actually go back to Rec 709 for a minute. So I'm going to go to my paint settings. And I'm just going to recall 709, go down here. So this is standard Rec 709 gamma. And Rec 709 is actually grades really well. Now, a lot of people are going, what? What's he talking about? Rec 709 doesn't grade very well. It actually grades really, really well, provided you're within the limits of the dynamic range of Rec 709. Because Rec 709 doesn't have any weird curves or anything else going on in it. It's what I would call a straight line gamma. And we can see that on the waveform here in the, oops, he says wrecking the place. That was probably very valuable and it's now completely broken. If we draw a line through the steps on the chart, we see a lovely straight line. And that's because the camera is recording this chart as it actually is. We're not compressing anything anywhere. We're not throwing away any picture information. We're recording it, basically the light in the scene as it truly is, one for one. We're not doing anything clever. And as we go up in brightness or up and down in brightness, what we'll see is that obviously that X shape remains an X shape. So we record it brighter, we get more information until we hit something called the knee, which occurs at about 90%. And when we hit the knee, everything gets compressed together. And you can see how that now becomes sort of, and then we hit the knee and it goes like that. Now, where Rec 709 becomes difficult to grade is when we've got this situation here where a lot of the range is in the knee. And that becomes difficult to grade because you've got to treat the highlights differently to the rest of the image because they're in two different ranges. The knee is changing the range of the gamma curve. Now, what the knee does allow us to do, though, is to capture a greater highlight range. So let's bring it down here. We can just about see the steps on the chart. The knee kicks in at 90% generally. Now, why 90%? Well, this comes down to black to white. So white, when we're talking of white, I've got a white square on here. That's what we mean. When we're talking about exposing white, a lot of people talk about, oh, expose white. Where do we expose white? We're not talking about the sky. We're not talking about something that's really, really bright. We're talking about this white, which is a particular reflectivity of white. This patch here reflects 90% of the light falling on it. And that's a pretty bright white. A piece of printer paper will reflect about, I think there's a piece of paper kicking around here somewhere, typically is a little bit brighter because they put whiteners and various other things in printer paper, stuff like that, to make it look bright. That will reflect about 92, 93% of the light falling on it. That reflects 90% of the light. But we have to think about these values as white, and then I want somebody brave enough here to tell me what color that is. It's not a trick question. Come on. Black. I show you that and everyone here goes, that's black. Yeah. But that isn't actually black. It's a black square that everyone will call black. But the fact that you can see it means it's not black. If it was absolutely black, you wouldn't actually be able to see it. But you can see it, can't you? We can all see that. It's a square there. So, but that shade that most people will call black basically is anything that reflects 4% of the light or less. Most people will call that black. If it reflects less than 4% of the light, people will call it black. Black to white, that is the most important part of anyone's exposure range because that's where all the important stuff is. People, faces, skin tones, plants, trees, the walls of this room, the floor, the ceiling, everything that isn't a source of light or a direct reflection of light falls in that range. If you think about it, what's brighter than white? It's going to actually be the light that is illuminating the white, the actual source of light. Or if you've got a car where you've got shiny reflections, they are direct specular reflections. They're the light actually directly bouncing off that car body as opposed to being a diffuse reflective surface. So the vast, vast majority of everything that we shoot that's important resides between black and white. And that's why when Rec 709 was designed and developed, white was put at 90%, because that means that 90% of your recording range is devoted to all the important stuff in the world, like people and faces and plants. And then we've got 10% of our recording range, and we'll cram the highlights and everything else into that little tiny bit right at the top there, because they're highlights, they're light fittings, they're light fixtures, they're the stuff that nobody actually cares about. I mean, how many of you, so what were the clouds in the sky like this morning? How many of you spent ages observing the clouds this morning? Most of us don't, come out and say, oh, beautiful clouds, and walk around staring at the sky because it hurts our eyes. We're looking at the buildings and the plants and the people, and they're all down here in this range. So when 709 was developed, TVs weren't as good as they are today, cameras weren't as good as they are today, so they made the most of what they had. 0 to 90% is black to white, and then they left a little bit at the top for highlights. So, and that's what we do today. We put, with modern cameras with Rec 709 or something that's 709 compatible, we use something called the knee above 90% to compress those highlights. So we don't actually lose them. They're still there. We can still kind of see those clouds in the sky, but instead of being nicely textured, detailed, beautiful clouds, they're blobs of white in a bright sky because they've all been squashed together. We've lost the contrast in those highlights, but it allows us to have that bigger dynamic range. Of course, the issue with that is it's really unattractive on people, where you've got somebody and they've got a specular reflection off the top of their head. Now, as you get a bit older and you lose all your hair, it becomes inevitable that your top of your head will get less and less beautiful when you're on television. As you get this specular highlight up here that's got no contrast. So it just becomes a single blob of color. And we've all seen that. If you've ever shot Rec 709, we've all seen it. You've all seen that person and they've got these pink blobs or whatever, because the knee affects the brightness but doesn't affect the color. So you have a nice bright blob up here, but it's still got a whole load of color, way too much color generally, and it just looks wrong. And that's Rec 709, and that's what we've lived with and dealt with for a very, very long time. But if you stay out of the knee or you turn the knee off, then the range below the knee, that 90%, actually grades really, really well. There's nothing special about S-Log that makes it particularly gradable. In fact, it's just that because it's what we use, the tools exist to grade it and are designed around it. But Rec 709 in a color managed workflow, if you stay out of the knee, actually grades better than S-Log 3 does. Anyway, so we have this knee, and it's not very pretty in Rec 709. It does nasty things to our highlights. Let's just take it up a little bit now, until we are just about losing those brighter steps on the chart. So we have this other curve now in this camera, which I'm going to recall now, which is S-Cinetone. Okay, so I've recalled that. If we look at the chart now, we can see those brighter steps a bit more clearly on the chart. If you look at the waveform, you can see that they are compressed, but a little bit less, a little bit more gently, and in the highlights, and this actually has a bit more dynamic range than Rec 709. If I expose this brighter still, oh, that's assigned to end. No, I hate it when I'm using a camera that's not mine and everything's assigned to all sorts of weird and wonderful things. As we go up, we actually get this curve appearing in the curve. And this is the shape of the S-Cinetone gamma curve, because it has this definite roll-off to the highlights. Gives us a very, very big dynamic range. And that roll-off starts, though, at about, if I bring this down, we've got to go all the way down to about, yeah, there it is. You can see it just starting about there. Now the lines on this waveform, one of these tells us the levels. No, they actually go 25, 50, 75, 100%. So the fainter line that is here is 75%, and that is roughly where this curve starts with S-Cinetone. Now, where do we very often expose faces and people? 709, zebras, 70%. Anyone heard that before? I would have thought most of us have heard that before. Now, zebras have a 10% wide window generally, plus and minus 5%. So the zebras are going to come on from 65 to 75% if we're doing that. So if we've got our zebras set at 70, what that means is that faces and skin tones are going to be right on the edge of that compression. So any brighter skin tones will be getting compressed. And it means that they don't actually look very nice with S-Cinetone. So I haven't changed my exposure. And we look at that, and at first glance, it's like, oh, okay, what's wrong with that? That looks all right to me. I can't see anything wrong there. Look at the blonde girl if I just bring the exposure down a little bit. You see the contrast increase in her face. It's not just the brightness. If I go back up, we were at F9, that's where we were. It's very washed out, very pale. Looks really, dare I say, Scandinavian. And then I come down, and not just as it doesn't just get darker, it gets more contrasty. And this is the way this curve is actually designed to work. So the idea is that you can choose how much contrast you have in your image by exposing just a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. And if we go up just a little bit, goes really washed out, really pale. And if we come down a little bit, becomes much more contrasty. And that's about a one-stop variation there. It's not a huge variation. So you can change how contrasty the image looks. There's also a roll-off at the bottom of the curve as well. So by exposing a little bit brighter or darker, we can choose how our S-Cinetone looks in terms of how contrasty the picture is. And that's really nice. So if we want something a bit more film-like, we just expose a little bit darker. And if we want something that looks a bit more like daytime TV, we can expose a bit brighter. And it will look a bit more like daytime TV. And it's really up to you. There's no rule that says you must expose it at this level. Now, I did a lot of looking at what the base exposure for S-Cinetone was, and I determined using a white card here, and this one's supposed to make you all feel very sick. It's actually a back focus or a focus chart, because as you go in and out of focus, the center of it does weird stuff. Look at that. It makes it very easy to see when you're actually in focus, or if you're doing a back focus. But anyway, now you're all feeling very ill. We'll go back to 709. And if I expose this so that the white is just touching 90%, you can see how the knee kicks in there. It's about there. And then we go back to the S-Cinetone without changing anything else. You'll see that that white drops from 90% down to just around about 83% it ends up at. So if you wanted to use a white card with S-Cinetone, you'd expose that same white target at 83% instead of 90%, much lower. And your skin tones typically are going to be around about 60% instead of 70% to get the sort of design exposure, as it were, of S-Cinetone. So it is designed to be exposed that little bit darker. And there is a trend these days to have television a little bit darker than it used to be. A little bit darker. Not so dark that you can't see it, but a little bit darker than things used to be. Okay, so let's now look at S-log. And actually, while I'm one of the things about zebras, while I'm talking about zebras to think about, is so Rec 709. So black to white is roughly 5 stops. If we start at 4%, we add a stop, that's 8%. We add another stop, that's 16%. We add another stop, that's 32. Another stop is 64, and then we get to 100 and something, 120%. But roughly, black to white is 5 stops. And it's roughly 2.5 stops from black to middle grey, and 2.5 stops from middle grey to white. And if you're ever trying to figure out where do I put skin tones, well, middle grey to white's 2.5 stops, and generally skin tones fall pretty much halfway between white and middle grey. So it's always going to be halfway between middle grey and white. So if you know that your middle grey in Rec 709 is about 50% and your white is 90%, so halfway between 50 and 90 is 70%. And the same happens with S-log. S-log 3, middle grey is 41%, white 61. So if you're exposing the S-log 3, halfway between 41 and 61 is 51. And that's where your skin tones would be. And it works for every gamma curve. So if you ever are unsure where the hell should skin tones be, if you can find out where middle grey and white are, then they're going to be roughly halfway between. S-cinetone, white, middle grey is 50%, white's 83%, so halfway between is about 63, 64%, somewhere down there. So it's a useful thing, little trick to know. And zebras, well, if 709 from black to white is 90% of my recording range, and that's 5 stops, that means that each stop is, on average, about 15% of the recording range. So if I've got zebras with a 10% wide window, plus and minus 5%, which is the default in almost every camera made, that 10% is less than a stop. It's about 2/3 of a stop. So if you're trying to figure out where your white card is or anything like that, you're going to be no worse than 2/3 of a stop within where you need to be. So it's reasonably accurate. But if we think about S-log 3, and if we go from S-log 3, middle grey is 41% to 61% for white, in that range we've got 2.5 stops. So each stop of exposure is actually only about 8.5%. But our zebras, if we leave our zebras at the default of 10% window, that's more than a stop. It's almost a stop and a third. So our zebras are only half as accurate if we're using them for S-log than they are with 709, unless we make the zebra window narrower, because 10% is a lot more than a stop. So if you're trying to use zebras to measure how bright your grey card is, you could be 1 1/3 stops out with your exposure, which is a hell of a lot. So you need to make that zebra window narrower when you're using S-log 3, if you're measuring the S-log 3, to be as accurate as you would have been with Rec 709. And I'm quite sure this is actually why a lot of people, they'll shoot something with S-log 3 and then they look at it later on and think, God, this is noisy, but I'm sure I was correctly exposed. And then you start digging, it's like, well, how did you determine your exposure? And I said, well, I got my white card or my grey card and I set it with my zebras. And it's like, well, where were you within that zebra range? Were you at the bottom or the top of it? And like, well, I don't know. It just had zebras on it. They could have been at 30, with a 10%, they could have been at 32%, which actually I'll tell you is 2 stops underexposed, because under middle grey, it's even smaller, that gap in the steps. They could have been, with a 10% window, they'd have been 5% under, so 41 would have been 36. And that is that's a stop and a half underexposed. And they'd have had zebras on their grey card, but they'd have been a stop and a half underexposed. So you've got to be really careful. You need to make that zebra window narrower. And we can do that in the monitoring section of the cameras. When we go to zebra, and you have the zebra aperture level. And instead of using 10% for S-Log3, I would recommend that you use 5%. And if you're using it to measure a card, a grey card or a white card, you could bring it all the way down to 2% to really make it accurate. Because if you're measuring your grey card, the last thing you want is zebras all over it, no matter what aperture you're at. You want to find the aperture where it's exposed correctly. So we'll leave it there. Now, I've done something here. I've set Zebra 1 to 61%, and I've set it to 78%. And the reason for that is Zebra 1 at 61% is white for S-Log3. And Zebra 2 at 78% is white for S709. That's the standard default LUT in these cameras. So I've got my white for S709 and my white for S-Log3, because on the FX6 you get these two orange lines that appear on your waveform. Unfortunately, you don't get them in the FX9. It's a really, really handy feature. So when I'm shooting log, so I'm now going to change to the Cine EI mode. Actually, let's first of all, I'll just show you how you can shoot log in custom mode. Let's go down to the paint settings. So what I can do is in base look or scene file, in fact, I should be able to recall an empty scene file. So if I recall this one's no file, no, there's no base, so I'm going to let me do it that way. I can select no LUT. And now I have, as the thing suggests, no LUT. And you'll see if we go down here that the input to this is S-Gamut3 Cine S-Log3. So what I'm actually recording now is S-Log3. And then my exposure, correct exposure, would be to have my white at 61%. And that would be my correct S-Log exposure. It's quite difficult, I think, to shoot this way, just without a lookup table or without gamma assist or anything else, just looking at S-Log3 on the monitor. Obviously, with a picture of something real, if we're shooting a real scene, it's a little bit easier. But I still find that very difficult to judge whether my exposure is right or wrong, because I can go up a bit and it gets brighter, and I go down a bit and actually it looks nicer. But actually, if anything, you're going to be better off being brighter exposed where the picture doesn't look as nice. So I find this a very difficult way to shoot. You can do this because you can add gain. If you need to desperately add gain when you're shooting S-Log directly to what you're recording, you can do that. But these cameras are something that's called ISO invariant, which is a very fancy word that basically means that when I change to change the ISO of this camera, which is exactly the same thing actually in these cameras as changing the gain, what I'm doing is changing the gain. I'm not actually making the camera more or less sensitive. I'm changing how much gain I'm adding. And we're adding that gain after the signal at the sensor has been converted to a digital one. So the sensor operates at two different sensitivities, our high base and our low base ISO. And that outputs then an analog signal to an analog to digital converter, and it's converted to a digital signal. And that ultimately is what we record, that digital signal. And any gain that you add, when you change the ISO that's not changing the base ISO, you're adding digital gain. Now, the thing is that when the signal passes through that analog to digital converter, it's converted into steps because we're into the digital domain. And those steps might be very small, but it's in steps. We don't have unlimited values. Everything's divided into our bit depth, into the steps in our digital recording. And we can add gain, but we don't actually make the camera more sensitive. And we're quite limited as to what we can do in terms of adding gain, because I'm being told I've got to hurry up. Because you're just, when you add gain, what you do is you make those steps bigger. When you add digital gain, because there's nothing in between those steps, you just basically make those steps bigger, so the image becomes coarser. It'll become brighter, but it also becomes coarser. And that's what we see actually with the noise. When you start adding a lot of digital gain, the noise doesn't just get bigger in amplitude, it becomes coarser, because we're just making all our steps bigger. So you don't really want to add a lot of digital gain either in camera or in post, but doing it in post is not different to doing it in camera. It's still gain. So there's not a lot of difference to how much noise you end up, whether you add the gain in the camera or you add it in post-production later on, because you're doing essentially the same process, adding gain. You can do it in the camera, do it in post, picture gets noisier in both examples. You do it in camera, you're doing it before it goes through the codec and it's compressed. Two aspects to that. There is some benefit to adding the gain in camera and making the signal bigger before it's compressed, but having more noise before you compress the signal puts a lot of extra stress on the codec. The codec doesn't like that. You'll have more compression artifacts. If you do the adding the noise in post-production, you're doing it on top of compression artifacts, so any compression artifacts that you have increase, but in post-production, you can add an unlimited amount of gain without changing your dynamic range. Because in post-production, you're going to be working in a computer, it's going to be working at 32 or even 64-bit, and internally in that computer, effectively, you have unlimited dynamic range, and you can then grade and manipulate the image. If you add too much gain in the camera, you limit the dynamic range because you make the signal too big to record. We've only got a 0 to 100% recording range. If you amplify, if your signal's already filling that and you add gain, where does the extra go? It's lost, gone. We don't gain any more in the shadows because we're not making the camera more sensitive, we're just turning the volume up. So you lose dynamic range when you add gain in camera, potentially. You add gain in post-production, you've already got the dynamic range, you've already captured that. So there are pros and cons to both, and it's important. You can use either, whichever works for you is fine, but understand the differences. Adding a lot of gain in camera will reduce your dynamic range, adding a lot of gain in post will not. Adding a lot of gain in camera may have a small benefit from perhaps slightly better textures, but doing it in post, you're adding gain on top of any compression artifacts, so they may become a bit more visible. So there is much less difference than people think there would be. In fact, the difference is very, very small. My personal choice is to do it in post. And to do that, then I use the Cine EI mode. So going into my project settings now, I better put this back into a sensible setting because otherwise somebody's going to be, what the hell's going on with this camera? Why is it in log? Let's just recall that, which will put it back to there. Okay. Project settings. Cine EI. And now we're in the Cine EI mode. And I'm going to select the high base ISO because that will make it easier to show some of the things I'm going to be showing. So I can do that from the quick menu. Right, and we can continue that after coffee. Yeah.
Jeg vil lige sige, at der er selvfølgelig kaffe og alt muligt derude, men der står et køleskab derude med sodavand og øl og alt muligt andet. Og hvis der er nogen, der ønsker vand, så kommer det frem på bordene lige om lidt. Så. Men vi tager lige et kvarter.
So if we can have the mic on, that's it. Okay. Right, I hope you are refreshed and ready to go. Yes! Right, okay. Before I go any further, because this is the last time you'll have to listen to me today. So there's some people going, oh, thank goodness for that. Is there anything that I've I'm going to do Cine EI now. I've done this a lot of times, and I know a lot of you have heard this before. So I'm wondering, is this what people want to learn about? Do you want to learn about Cine EI and log and exposure? Is there anything else anybody would like me to cover? Don't be afraid.
Slow motion.
Slow motion. Okay, that's a good one. All right, let's carry on, and then I'll try and do what I call the stunt modes in the camera, which is slow motion, cache record, interval record, and stuff like that in a bit. So we are seeing some really significant and important changes happening in these cameras right now, going on under the bonnet, under the hood. And I was having a discussion during the coffee break, and it was quite relevant to this. So for a very long time, we've had cameras that have shot using this Cine EI mode. And trust me, I've got into some very heated debates about this on Facebook and various other places. This is not significantly different in the Sony cameras to any of the other digital cinema cameras that are out there. Whether you shoot with RED, whether you shoot with an ARRI, they all work in a broadly similar way. There are subtle nuances that are a little bit different, but actually it's not that different to how a camera shooting RAW works or anything else. And that is the basic principle here is that we set the camera to its base ISO, because that's where you get the maximum dynamic range. And the reason you get the maximum dynamic range at the base ISO is you're taking the entire output of that sensor, everything that it can possibly output from the deepest shadows to the brightest highlights, and you're mapping it perfectly to the recording bucket. So we've got this recording container that we can record everything in, and we map what comes off the sensor to that recording container, and we record it. Now, as I mentioned before the break, if we take that sensor output and we add gain to it, well, it becomes even bigger. But our recording bucket doesn't. So we lose all these highlights. They disappear off the top and they're lost. So that's why we want to stay at the base ISO, because it's the only place where we get the maximum dynamic range. And what happens if we decrease the gain? Well, we make this signal smaller. Well, now we've got this great big recording bucket, but half of it's empty. So you always want to be at that base ISO to really maximize getting everything that the sensor can deliver into the recording bucket so we can take it into post-production. Now, the beauty about log is that log is a very different gamma curve to Rec 709, etc. Now, do you remember when I showed you the Rec 709 before the break and I opened and closed the aperture, I changed the exposure, that the steps on the chart went as we went up and down in exposure. It did that. It expanded and contracted. So when the exposure was low, the steps were really, really small. And when the exposure was much brighter, the steps were much bigger. Yeah? We all remember that? Good. So I don't have to show you that again, because that would be tedious. So let's have a look at log. And why is log different? What makes log special? So first of all, I'm going to turn off all my lookup tables and everything else. So we're actually going to be looking at the log. Oh, I'll tell you what, let's do it with the quick menu. So turn off the lookup tables. I'm going to turn them off here as well, so I'm looking at the same thing. So we're now looking at the log. The camera is at the base ISO of 12,800. I'm going to leave it at this high base ISO because we don't have a huge amount of light here. It'll allow me to do this more easily. And if we look at the steps on the chart, so can anybody remember where middle gray sits? If we look at this chart here, actually. Middle gray, 18% gray. It's very close to the background of this chart, middle gray. In fact, it's this shade of gray just here. Just about see it in here. Let me show you something. Which charts have I got here? A lot of you might have one of these, or the color checker video, which has got the four white, two grays, and none of those grays are middle gray. Really useful chart. And if we look at this chart, none of these greys are middle grey. Thank you, data color. So that makes life really difficult for us. This happens to be middle grey on this chart here. So make sure if you're using a grey card that your grey card actually has middle grey on it and not some other random shade of grey. So we want that middle grey to be at 41% with S-Log3. And if we remember, black to white, middle grey sits roughly halfway between. And in fact, on this chart where you've got the crossover, white to black, of course, middle grey is roughly in the middle of that crossover that we see, the X pattern. So let's get this exposed. So middle grey is at 41%. In fact, it's there already. The chart isn't quite evenly illuminated. Let's just see if I can, which side of it's in. A little bit better. It's a bit more evenly illuminated. So my middle grey, looking at this teeny tiny waveform that's just about impossible to read. That's just too high now, isn't it? I need to bring it back down. It's going to be somewhere around there. So this orange line is 61%. This line here is 50%, and then middle grey is where this crosses over. It's a little bit underneath here, and that is about it's going to be roughly 41%, just in there. So we've got middle grey at 41%, and then, so this dotted line here, which is actually 50%, is just above middle grey. Above that is our highlight range, but with log, we don't have a highlight roll-off. You remember with S709, with Rec 709, with S-Cinetone, as soon as we went above white, we applied that thing called the knee, didn't we? And we've squashed everything together. Well, log is different. So log is, take Rec 709 and turn it upside down. So below middle grey, we have a roll-off instead of in the highlights, and above middle grey, there is no roll-off. It's upside down. So as I bring the exposure up, can you see how the X just goes up and down like that? Before, with 709, it used to stretch out and get smaller. It used to do that. Yeah? Well, once you're above middle grey with S-Log3, it just goes up and down. Doesn't stretch out. Just bobs up and down. You see how it's not getting any bigger, it's just going up and down. Below middle grey, it squashes together and it gets smaller. But once we go above middle grey, it stays the same size and it just goes up and down. Now, what's important to consider when we think about that, and that's what this diagram here represents. So this is middle grey in the middle. This is below middle grey, and we've got a roll-off. It gets squashed together. Above middle grey, these are our stops of exposure. Every single stop above middle grey is recorded with exactly the same amount of picture information. So what that means is it doesn't matter where you expose anything above middle grey, because it'll be the same. Remember, faces and skin tones with 709, if we overexposed them, they went into a roll-off. They got squashed. We got that highlight issue on people's heads because of the knee. All of those things were happening as soon as we exposed a little bit brighter. But with S-Log3, because everything above middle grey is handled exactly the same, there is no change to the contrast. So we can expose a face anywhere we want above middle grey, provided it's not clipped, it will have exactly the same contrast. It will look identical in the log, not different. So far, so good. Below middle grey, there is a roll-off. Everything gets squashed together. We lose picture information. So the last thing that we want to do with log is to be underexposed. We can be overexposed. It's good. If we overexpose, what's down here and squashed together, we expose it a bit brighter, stretches out until once it's above middle grey, it stays the same. As soon as we go under, everything gets degraded. So we never want to be underexposed, ever, with log. It's really, really bad thing. But if we can expose nice and brightly, we can expose as brightly as we want, provided we don't clip. and it will be fine. So let's play dangerous here. I'm going to expose my chart. Where's clipping? It's all the way. Have I got enough light to clip it? I haven't. I'm going to expose it really, really brightly. So my white now, instead of being at 61%, is way up here. So my white now is right on the verge of clipping. I might just bring that down a tiny bit, just a tiny, tiny bit. But thank you for the extra light, that is appreciated. We'll put it here. If white is here, and I've exposed this now somewhat, the white on my chart is, well, if that's 61%, this is really close to about 94%, which is where this clips about here. That's 2.5, probably close to 3 stops overexposed, something like that. If I'd overexposed 709, 3 stops over, what would it look like? You are allowed to say shite, because it would look awful. So let's have a look with log. Those of you that shoot log will be going, oh, I've done this. I know what he's talking about now. This is all easy peasy stuff. We look at the log and it's like, ooh, yeah, okay, that's not good, is it? But if we put the lookup tables on now and we don't do anything else, it is going to look, actually, I don't know what the EI has been set to. Still looks nasty. So my exposure index is currently set way, way up. Let's just set that to 12,800. So the exposure index matches the base ISO. This is a 1-to-1 match, and it looks nasty. But if I then lower the exposure index to make the LUT darker, the only thing I'm doing is making the LUT darker. In fact, I can't go down far enough. Almost there. And the picture looks fine. And if I could go even further on the exposure index, that picture would look fine. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And it would have 0 noise by the time you brought the levels that far down again in post-production or whatever. So the way this works is it allows us as filmmakers to choose where we put our exposure. We're not backed into a corner with this where we have to expose at a very specific point. It gives us the ability to choose how we expose the shots that we're doing based on how we want it to look. If we want it to be super low noise, we expose brighter, then we take that footage, that really bright footage, into post-production and bring the level down. If we want to have a huge highlight range, then we expose darker, because that putting less light on the sensor allows you to have a bigger highlight range. If you want to have a bigger shadow range, you expose brighter. You put more light onto the sensor, and that will give you a better shadow range. But if we go back to this slide here, which applies equally to the FX6, except that would be 800 and 12,800. So what we're doing is, if we use an exposure index that is lower than what we're recording at, we make the LUT darker. When we make the LUT darker and we look in our viewfinder and we see a really dark picture, what do? Open the aperture. So you put more light onto the sensor. And when we put more light onto the sensor, what happens is we lose some highlight range, because you just can't put an infinite amount of light onto the sensor, but we extend the shadow range and have less noise. And then we go the opposite way and we use a really high exposure index value. The lookup table is made really, really bright. So the picture in the viewfinder is really, really bright. So you step down, you close your aperture a bit. That gives you a much bigger highlight range because you're putting less light onto the sensor, but a much reduced shadow range, and it will be much noisier because in post-production you'll be bringing the levels up. Yeah? We all get that? Most of you are nodding. So, equally, I could just now put my exposure index to 12,800, and I could adjust my exposure so the picture here of the girls looks roughly right. I'm cheating. Somewhere like that. And then if we turn the lookup table, now we'll all agree that picture looks more or less right, yes? And then if I turn the LUT off, and we're looking at the image here, and if I swap this for the grey chart, and we look at where the exposure is, we can see that white is, it's looking at the log, is just around 61%, and middle grey is just a bit under the 50% line. It's a touch overexposed perhaps, but it's more or less the correct exposure, just by looking at the picture in the viewfinder. It's much easier to do with the charts are really useful for measuring stuff, but not much else. Because human vision is incredibly adaptive. We adapt to what we see. It's like why we don't have to white balance. We don't go into a room and say, oh, that's the wrong color temperature. I need to white balance my eyes. Our brain just does it for us. When we look at a chart, our brain just sees this random image of a chart and doesn't really know quite how to interpret it, because we don't look at charts normally. But as soon as you look at a picture of the girls here, it's an image we recognize. So we're much better able to evaluate what we're seeing, because it's something we recognize, something we can identify with. Now, and while actually we're talking about that, one of the things this is a tip I learned a long, long time ago, and that's why this is actually a very carefully designed test chart. So the white of the waves is 90% reflectivity white. The skin tones, you have a big variation of skin tones. This green color on here is, if you put it on a waveform, falls into the cyan box on a vectorscope. This red on the ball falls into the red box on a vectorscope. It's actually a very carefully designed chart, and it costs a stupid amount of money. But a tip that I learned a very long time ago, so I like to go into the custom modes on the camera and play with picture profiles or design lookup tables and things like that, is if I was to show you that on a screen and it was a bit wrong, you would not notice it. I mean, how does anybody know what color that's supposed to be, really? Whereas if I showed you a picture and the sky was a really weird shade of teal, or people's faces were orange, you'd immediately recognize there's something wrong with that image. So a tip that I got given a long, long time ago is to find a really nice picture that you like of a real-world scene, and a really good example is something like a fairground or a circus, where you've got lots of bright colors, maybe the tent is red, blue sky, green grass, people, and get a load of copies of that printed at a very good quality print shop. And then you can use that as a reference wherever you go. If you want to do some lookup tables, rather than pointing the camera out of the window on a random day and trying to create a lookup table based on quite a dull grey day today, perhaps summer's day, it would look very different outside, and trying to create lookup tables based on these greatly varying scenes, you can use that picture as your reference point, because it never changes. And then you can color it, you can grade it, you can make your lookup table or whatever based on that picture, and it's constant. So every time you make a change, you get the same end result, because you're always using that same point of reference. So it's something worth getting made up, getting printed out, a nice picture with nice range of colors and things like that, and it's probably actually for most of us more useful than a test chart. And you could go on location. If somebody's been messing with your camera and you point it at the picture and you look in the viewfinder, you'll spot when it's not right immediately, because it just won't look right. You know, skin tones might be wrong, sky might be an odd color. You point it at your chart, you might not pick out that, well, there isn't actually a sky color on there, but that the sky's the wrong color or things like that. So charts are useful, but I would get a nice reference picture as well, laminate it, keep it in your camera bag, take it with you, use it as a point of reference. Anyway, coming back to this, Cine EI, so when the EI at the bottom matches the base ISO, you can actually just expose by eyeballing it, by looking at the picture on the viewfinder, and if it looks right, it probably is right. If you're worried about being underexposed, which is the problem, where you're going to run into an issue, if you lower the EI a little bit, let's go lower. Let's say we go to Let's go down to one. That's one stop, 6,400. The viewfinder image is now darker. Looking at my viewfinder, if I see a little bit of a dark image, I'm going to expose it a little bit brighter. That's too bright, somewhere in there. And now I know that my log, when I turn the LUT off, is going to be a little bit brighter. We can see that the brightest parts of the picture are between that bottom line, which is 61%, which is white, and the 83%. Now that 83% line is where white with S709 should be. So by having these two orange lines here, I can measure either the white of the LUT or the white of the S-log3. Now, because I'm at a low EI, 6,400, my white on the LUT, if my white on my 90% white via the LUT is on that 83% line at 6,400, because the EI is lower, the LUT is darker, that means that my log will be brighter. Yeah? We get that, good. So I can use the exposure index to control how my exposure is. A little trick here, a little tip. So FX9, FX6 are the same. They have a high, medium, and low button on the side of the camera, and I can set different EIs to this button. My way I work is I like to put in the middle position the exposure index that I am choosing to shoot at. Often when I'm using 12,800 base, because I know this is a bit noisy, I will use 6,400 EI, because that means I'm going to expose everything a stop brighter, take it into post-production, bring the levels down, most of that noise just disappears, not an issue. So then in the low position, what I like to do is I like to put my lowest possible, oops, wrong thing, is the lowest EI. So I'm going to put 3,200 in there. And then in the high position, I put the highest EI. So now I can go back to my middle position. So this is my shooting exposure index. Now, if I want to check what's going on with my highlights, so I'm going to open the aperture up. If you were looking at that, you might think, oh my God, is that overexposed? What's happening? Is it clipping? Because it looks kind of clipped. What's going on with my recording? I can then flip that up to the low EI, and I can see that my highlights are not clipped. Brings them down. If we go the opposite way, so making sure I do the right thing, aperture, and we go, let's say we go down here. It's like, how bad is that? Let's say that's the best exposure you can get. You're shooting somewhere in the dark, and that's all you've got. That's you're wide open, and that's the image you've got. Well, then we can flip the switch down to high, and that will give me an idea of what this might look like in post-production. And certainly from this distance, I can see that this is really noisy, and I'd be able to see how much noise I've got. So by having the EI that you're going to shoot at in the middle, you can set your exposure to what it needs to be, and then we can flick that switch. We can look at here. This would allow me to see the highlights. So if I've got a bright sky or something like that in the background, I'd be able to see that that's not terribly badly overexposed. It's a bit over, but it's not terrible. Then I'm looking at my mid-range where it's clearly looking overexposed, and then I can look at that and I can see what's going on in my shadow range. So that allows me to sort of get a better feel for what's going on at the extremes of the range that I'm shooting at by doing that. Now, I started saying there's a lot changing in these cameras now and the way all of this works. No card in this one. One of the things that's coming with the Sony Cine line cameras is something called embedded LUT. The FX6 doesn't have it yet, but it is coming. The FX3, FX30, FX9, they all have this now. And when you're shooting in the Cine EI mode, you have the option in the menu to choose to embed the LUT, embedded LUT. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that when you shoot now with those cameras, and it is going to come to the FX6, I've been told, I've been reassured it will come very soon, is that when we record, if I go to the Finder on my computer here, this is some FX30 footage here. You can see a card, private folder, M4 root folder, and in this folder here called General and LUT, that's the LUT that I used when I shot. And even if you put a custom LUT in the camera, so if you load your own custom LUT into the camera, that will be saved in this folder. So every time you shoot, when you have embedded LUT turned on, the camera will save the LUT that you've used while you were shooting with your footage. And then as well as that, we have the metadata about how we've set the exposure index and our base ISO. So what that means now is when I take this footage into, I'm going to take it into Catalyst Browse. So let's find that. I think it's in here. So when I open up this folder here, and where you can see the little cube symbol there, looks like a Rubik's Cube. That is to symbol that the LUT has been saved with that footage. So that's telling me that the footage has the LUT embedded with it. And see if I open this clip up. And without doing anything, it looks how it was when I shot it in the viewfinder. I haven't done anything. I haven't graded. I haven't changed anything. And your footage will look exactly as it did when you saw it in your viewfinder. So the software has added the LUT. If I go to adjust color, you'll see here it's, where is it? Here we are, embedded LUT, S703 to S709 LUT. So it's embedded the LUT. I've set this is set to metadata by default. So it's added the LUT by default because that's what it choose. I was obviously shooting at 4,300 white balance, no tint adjustment, and I was actually shooting at 2000 EI, just to have a little bit less noise. And it's applied the exposure offset, the EI offset, the LUT, and everything else exactly as the camera was set. And this is actually how a red camera works when you're shooting RAW. And the only reason that's actually different or been different is because if you're shooting with a RAW camera, whether that's Venice, whether that's red, whether that's ARRI RAW, is that to be able to make the raw image viewable, it must be processed. It's got to be converted from Bayer to a color picture. So the software that you use, your editing software or your grading software, has to process the image. It can't just display it as it comes from the camera. So that means that whenever you work with RAW, there is extra software in your edit application or your grading application that's doing that processing. And built into that software will be what's happening here, which is the addition of the exposure index, the corrections required for the exposure index that the camera was set to, and the LUT or the look that you had selected in the camera. So that's always happened with RAW cameras because it has to happen, or at least certainly with cameras that have internal RAW. It doesn't work with external RAW, so if you shoot ProRes RAW, because the metadata doesn't get from the camera to the external recorder. So the external recorder has no idea what exposure index you are using. So it doesn't work with ProRes RAW. But with the cameras that do have internal RAW, like Sony's Venice, the red cameras, or if you're using an ARRI and shooting RAW, because all that data is embedded, they do this. And that's why an ARRI camera always looks the way it did at the time you shot it, and a red always looks the way it did at the time you shot it. But now that the LUT's being embedded with the footage with the Sony cameras, there's no reason why this can't also happen now with the Sony cameras. So one of the things that Sony are desperately trying to make work, it's a little bit buggy at the moment, is there is a Catalyst plugin for Adobe Premiere. So if you work in Adobe Premiere and you bring your Sony log footage in with the Catalyst plugin, it does this automatically. and your footage looks exactly as it did when you shot it. So if you've used a very low exposure index, exposed really, really brightly, you bring it into post-production and it looks right. It doesn't look overexposed anymore. It doesn't look wrong. It looks how you intended it to look. So this is a really important thing. Now, when we'll see this as just as built into Premiere, built into FCP, etc., Resolve, I don't know. But one of the issues has always been was that because there are so many different LUTs that you could use in this camera, and each LUT has different contrast, different ranges and everything like that, it was very, very difficult to implement before. But now that the LUT will always be with the footage, there's no reason now why this can't be implemented in all these different bits of editing and grading software. So I have my fingers crossed that this will become just the way the Sony cameras work in the future, which is going to make our lives immensely easier when we start shooting a bit brighter because we want a bit less noise and everything else, and our clients get it, and it looks like the way we intended it to look, rather than the client going, "Oh, why is your footage all overexposed?" And it's like, well, it's not overexposed. I chose to expose more brightly. Well, that's the truth of it. If you use a low exposure index to deliberately expose brighter because you want less noise, that's not overexposed. You've just chosen to expose brighter. Because overexposure is a mistake, generally. When we talk about, oh my God, that's overexposed, it's generally because somebody screwed up, because they didn't actually mean it to be that way. Yeah, but if that's the way you intended it to be, that's not a mistake, and that's not overexposure, that's just brighter exposure, because that brighter exposure gives you a better end result. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just brighter exposure. And it's one of the things I in the early days of talking about this workflow to people, I did call it overexposure, exposing brighter, and that was a mistake. I should have been very careful about how to describe what we're doing, because this is not a mistake. If I use a low exposure index to get a better end result, that's not overexposure. That is a brighter exposure to get a better end result. And I think we have to be a little bit careful as filmmakers when we talk about stuff like this, especially to people that haven't come across it before and don't understand, especially perhaps if you're talking to your client and explaining it. If you try to explain to your client, well, I deliberately overexposed everything, an awful lot of clients are going, you did what? And if you explain it to them a little bit differently, say, well, I deliberately exposed a bit brighter so you can have less noise, it's not quite so alarming to your clients. Anyway, but this hopefully will come to everything. But of course, we can go to manual, we can override all that metadata, and we can do whatever we want. Ooh, that's noisy if you crank that up. You wouldn't want to do that. But yeah, so hopefully this is something that will make our lives much easier. And you can see, in this example here, it just looks correct.
Try turning the LUT off there.
If I turn the LUT off, then we have the log. Or what would have happened in the past, if I go to manual, it would have applied the 709-800 LUT by default, and then it wouldn't have put the exposure offset in, so it would have looked like that. It's close, but it's not how I intended it. You can see that the highlights don't quite look as nice. It's not as nice looking as looking image. We go back to metadata, and we have what I intended it to look like. It's a subtle difference in this case because I wasn't that far off on the exposure index, but I could have been a lot further off on the exposure index, and it still would have ended up looking right. And that's the important thing, is it looks the way you intend it to look. And where it gets really exciting, actually, from my opinion, is when you start loading in custom LUTs into the camera. You've chosen this custom LUT that you really like, and there's loads on my website that are free to download, and do dive in and help yourselves. Very often they have different contrast range or different highlight ranges and things like that. So being able to have the custom LUT in the viewfinder, expose for the LUT, and then the footage goes into post-production and it has that LUT put on it at the EI that you shot at, and it all looks like how you wanted it to look. This is a really important and powerful point in workflows for us with these cameras. And I would really encourage, if you ever do, for whatever reason, get to talk to Adobe and everyone, push and push and push and say, well, why don't you, the data is there in these cameras now, why don't you implement it? Because I think it'd be really important. Now, talking of Adobe, of course, you've all now seen that, who uses Adobe Premiere here? A lot, yeah. I used to be for, probably 15 years, maybe more than that. I can't think when I started using Premiere. Premiere 1.0 I started with, way back in the 1990s, early 90s. And I've been using Premiere for probably 20 years. And for a company that does color and imagery and everything like that, that's their main thing, they really seem to have lost their way recently. Suddenly, everyone's log footage looked really weird. Everyone's used to seeing this really flat, washed out, graded image in Adobe Premiere, and then suddenly one day it doesn't look flat and washed out and it looks like Rec 709. It's like, what the hell have you done to my footage? And what's happened there is Adobe implemented a color managed workflow into Premiere and forgot to tell anyone about it. And not only did they forget to tell anyone about it, they forgot to tell anyone how to use it. So this is something we all need to be aware of, because this is going to come whether we like it or not. So what does it mean? Because these cameras are wonderful, but a lot of this stuff is equally about our workflow. Now, I'm going to use DaVinci Resolve here to demonstrate this, because I can turn it on and off in DaVinci Resolve, whereas in Premiere, that's a little bit more difficult at the moment. So Premiere is going to change. Premiere are going to remove the color managed workflow from their software. It will still be there, but it won't be default anymore. It will default to the way it was before, so the log will look flat, but you'll be able to turn on color management. So let's start a new project. And let's just bring in some footage. I've got footage in here. So I've got various clips here. We'll just give the thumbnails a chance. So most of these are S-Log3. And if I go to my edit window and I drop a couple of clips in here, let's see. We see some fairly flat, fairly washed out looking footage. This is S-Log3. Well, first things first. S-Log3. How much dynamic range does the S-Log3 curve have? Well, lots and lots and lots. But that's FX6 footage there. So let's say that shot's got 14 stops of dynamic range. How can something with 14 stops of dynamic range possibly look flat? 14 stops of dynamic range is an enormous contrast range. There is a big myth or a misunderstanding, I think, with S-Log3. S-Log3 is not flat. S-Log3 is immensely contrasty. The problem is that this projector here is set to Rec 709. We're looking at S-Log3 gamma using Rec 709 gamma. We've created a mismatch. There is a big, big difference between this gamma curve and the gamma curve of the projector. And that means our S-Log3 footage does not look correct. It looks wrong. So it's not that this is it's not that that's the way S-Log3 actually looks. We're just looking at it in an incorrect way, which makes it look flat and washed out. So one of the things that this is all about with color managed workflows is to actually allow you to look at what you shot correctly as opposed to incorrectly. So if I go into Resolve now and I look at the color management settings here, it's set to DaVinci YRGB, which is a normal workflow. That's how every edit platform, FCP, Premiere, etc., just generally works these days, which is no conversions. You just stick it in. If your monitor is Rec 709, we'll just pop it on that Rec 709 monitor, and if it's wrong, it's wrong. We don't care. So what you're looking at is incorrect. But what we can do is we can turn on color management. So initially, I'm going to go to DaVinci's built-in color management, and I'm going to tell it that we're processing in standard dynamic range, because we're going to view this in standard dynamic range. And we're going to output Rec 709 and click Save. Interesting, something happened to my pictures. They look nice and contrasty. I haven't graded this. I haven't done anything. I haven't added a LUT. What's now happening is that DaVinci Resolve is managing my footage. It's read the metadata and says, oh, you shot that with S-Log3, but it knows that because I've told it that we're viewing this in Rec 709, so it's converting the S-Log3 to the Rec 709 color space and gamma, and it looks correct. So this is actually what S-Log3 looks like. That's not a mistake. That is now correct. This is what S-Log3 actually looks like. So let's see if I can find a Rec 709 clip somewhere that I know is Rec 709. I think there should be some in here. Let me see. 709. Yeah, here we go. This is a Rec 709 clip. So let me bring this into my project. And let's put this into the timeline, Rec 709. Oh, that looks right as well. Because Blackmagic or DaVinci Resolve's reading the metadata. It says, oh, well, that's Rec 709. So we'll show that correctly as well in a Rec 709 workflow. And I could bring in footage from other cameras, from a Canon shot with Canon C-Log or Panasonic with V-Log. And they would all look right. And I wouldn't have to put a LUT on any of them. And can I grade them? Absolutely. I'm not losing anything at all in a color managed workflow in terms of the ability to grade. And what becomes really interesting, because one of the things I said to you right at the beginning was you can grade Rec 709 really well. Well, when you're working in this type of workflow, 709 grades the same as the S-Log3, grades the same as the V-Log, they all grade the same. There's not a difference. Provided you're within the dynamic range of the gamma curve, it will grade really well. Now, obviously, with the Rec 709 here, you can see that window that's peeping in over their shoulders is overexposed and blown out, because that's Rec 709's within the limit of Rec 709. This is S-Log. We have the nice highlight roll-off going into the torches, because that's the way S-Log works. If I was looking at this on an HDR screen, and I'd told Blackmagic, the DaVinci Resolve, to output in HDR, I'd be seeing all of these shots in HDR. Even the Rec 709 would be converted to HDR automatically. And that is something that we all need to think about. How many of you have bought a phone within the last 18 months? Quite a few. Some are going, I'm not going to admit that I bought the latest iPhone or whatever phone. How many bought a TV in the last 18 months? Or a tablet? Or a laptop? Between all of those products, probably almost all of us have bought one in the last couple of years. There's a fairly good chance that if it's a fairly recent model, it will be capable of displaying HDR. My phone is, this phone here, I've had this a couple of years now, it's HDR, or has the ability to display HDR. My TV at home does. This Mac does, it's HDR. This isn't something that's going to go away. HDR is going to become normal. And give it another 4 or 5 years, and I mean, most people replace a TV every 5 or 6 years, maybe at the most 8 years, I think. Give it another 5 or 6 years, and most people will have an HDR TV. I'm pretty sure that almost everybody will have an HDR phone or a tablet or a computer. We can't just keep delivering standard dynamic range forever, because standard dynamic range is going to fade away. And the need to deliver HDR is going to become more and more important. Now, if I do videos for YouTube now, they're all done in HDR, because YouTube is an HDR platform now. YouTube, Vimeo, if you upload in HDR to YouTube, it will create automatically SDR and HDR versions. So depending on what device somebody watches your video on, it's streamed to them in the most appropriate version for the device they're watching it on. If you deliver it in SDR, they'll only ever get it in SDR. They won't get an HDR version. But if you upload to YouTube in HDR, if they've got an HDR phone, they'll watch it in HDR. If they've got a standard dynamic range, they'll get the standard dynamic range version. And both will look fine, will look great. So we really do need to be thinking about delivering in HDR. It's not, you can't just stick your head in the sand and say, no, it'll go away. It's not like 3D, because you haven't got to put fancy glasses on and all of that palaver to watch a 3D film. This is something that our devices will just do anyway. Won't cost anybody any extra. That's how they will be. That's what they'll have. So we need to think about it. And a color managed workflow makes it really easy to do. Because let's go and grade, if I grade, I don't have an HDR monitor, so I can't really show this, but if I was to grade this shot in SDR, I could do all my shots. It wouldn't be the ideal way to do it, but then I could go to my color management here and I could say, right, let's change the processing to HDR and we'll output in HDR, and we would click save, and, well, color management is a wonderful thing. This is all working absolutely beautifully right now. But you didn't see much of a difference because my laptop knows that that's an SDR projector. So there's a whole load of color management going on here. On this screen, that image is in HDR. On the projector, it's feeding it in SDR. It's doing it all magically. So now I could just click export and I could export an HDR version of this video, just like that. Really that easy, that simple. And so color management is something we need to understand because it will make your lives a lot easier, but it's also going to change the way you do things. Because I can think, how many of you use LUTs? Lookup tables, lots of people, yeah. How the hell do you use a LUT in this workflow? Because this workflow is designed for S-Log3. If I apply a LUT for S-Log3 now onto this clip, let's just see what happens. I'm just going to apply S709. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. That's definitely not what I intended that to look like. Because the problem now is that our footage is not being, our log isn't being treated as Rec 709. Our log is being treated as log. So our LUTs that are designed for, let's call it broken, Rec 709, which is S-Log3 displayed in a 709 space, won't work in a color managed workflow. Now, it doesn't mean we can't use LUTs. It just means we can't use LUTs designed for S-Log3 in a 709 workflow. We have to use LUTs designed for S-Log3 in a color managed workflow. So you will have to get new LUTs or take the LUTs that you've got and convert them for the workflow that you're using. You can still use LUTs. The other way we can do it is if I take this shot and I bypass the color management for that shot, I can then use my LUT on it because I'm bypassing the color management. Doesn't look quite as nice because I'm outputting in HDR and this LUT wasn't designed for HDR. But we can still do it. The other, actually looks pretty good on this screen because this screen is HDR, you get a better idea of what it's meant to look like now in HDR. The other workflow we've got on here, this is DaVinci's color management, is now another workflow called ACES. I have to change a few more settings when I use this, so there's different versions of ACES, and each of these different versions of ACES is based on a different film look. So ACES is from the Academy, Academy Color Encoding System, and that's from the Academy of Motion Pictures, and this is designed for film. So it's based on making stuff look like film. So the different ACES version, each version of ACES is a different film-like look. So they all create a very film-like look. And then you choose your version depending on how you want your footage to look. Then you tell it, well, I shot this with S-Log3. So I go down here and I say I shot this with S-Log3. And I want to output in Rec 709. Rec 709. Click save, and we're back to there again. But again, I haven't graded this. It's still got the LUT on it. The other footage will just look like that. Looks kind of film-like. The Rec 709 will look wrong. So ACES is a little bit different. I now have to tell ACES that this is Rec 709. So I can just right-click on the clip, ACES input transform, and I can go Rec 709. So you can mix different formats, different standards within ACES, but ACES looks more film-like than the DaVinci color manage. So if you're after a very filmic look, ACES is really good. Now the big thing about ACES is a standard. So ACES, if it gets implemented in any other software, always behaves exactly the same. So you can take ACES footage from Resolve, from anywhere, and it always looks the same in any ACES platform. So it is a very standardized workflow. I use this a lot, ACES. I deliver a lot of HDR. I find it very easy to deliver HDR content using ACES. And I like that consistency that I could go into another edit platform and it will look the same. But this is all about color management instead of just using LUTs. I think it will ultimately make everybody's life much, much easier, because we don't have to worry about, oh God, what did I shot that on? What color space was that in? Etc. And how do I want to deliver it? Because you'll just simply change, well, I want to deliver this in 709, or I want to deliver this in HDR, or I shot this on S-Log, or I shot this on 709. And the software does all the color management for you. You don't have to do anything. If you shoot on any of the RAW cameras and you bring them into ACES, they look fabulous because all the transforms are just automatically applied. It just happens. It's like a little magic trick. There's none of this fiddling around with LUTs and all of that business anymore. So at least be aware of color managed workflows and what they are and what they mean. And that's what Adobe implemented in Premiere, was a color managed workflow, but they didn't tell anybody that that's what they'd done or how to use it. It's now being taken out as the default, and it will default back to a standard YCBCR, just an ordinary workflow as it was before, but you will be able to turn on color management and have this as well. But you will need to change your LUTs. And again, that's something I'm still waiting for Adobe to do some documentation on how they recommend LUTs should be implemented in their particular version of a color managed workflow. With Resolve, it's very easy, because if you just bypass the color management, you can just use the LUTs that you used previously. So color managed workflows, right. Coming back to the camera then, we can leave the camera in log. Can we have the camera back on the screen? So, stunt modes. Obviously, that's what I call them. Other people call them other things. So what have we got? We have interval record. So interval record you would use for shooting time-lapse, and you can set an interval from 1 second up to 24 hours. Why anyone would want a 24-hour interval on a camera like this, I have no idea. Yeah, so maybe a year later you might come back to your camera and have something worth using, but it's not really the right camera for that type of application. Generally speaking, I tend to use 1 second, the sort of lower, up to maybe 5 seconds, depending on what I'm doing. You can always speed up a time lapse in post if you need to, if you've not shot it fast enough. You can't really slow it down if you've used too long an interval. Clouds going across the sky, maybe 2 seconds. Something that maybe happens over an hour or 2 hours, maybe 4 or 5 seconds, something like that, depending on what you want. And don't forget, you can mix this with that slow shutter function to have the blurry headlights or a longer exposure and things like that. Number of frames, again, I don't really understand why anyone would want more than 1 frame at a time, because it just creates a very stuttery time lapse. Pre-lighting, that's so you can plug in Sony's video light onto the MI shoe and it turns the light on a fraction of a second before the camera takes the shot. Just so you get the light comes on, camera takes the shot, light goes off again. So that's what that's for. Very rare. I don't think I've ever actually seen somebody use one of those lights. Then we have picture cache record, and depends on the resolution that you're shooting at, but it's up to a 30-second memory in the camera, and that is added on to your recording when you press the record button. So as it's set right now, I press the record button, and the 31 seconds before I press the record is added onto my recording. Now, if you are having an affair with the producer's wife, it's not a good idea to discuss that with the sound recordist when you're using picture cache record. I've seen it happen, and it was very sad for all concerned. Sat in the edit suite. Yeah, okay. That cameraman never worked for an awful lot of people ever again. So yeah, be careful what you're chatting about. Oh, that producer, he's a wanker. I don't like working with him. And then it goes into the edit suite. That's it. You're done. So yeah, best to keep your mouth shut when you're using cache record, because it does record audio. But it's a very useful function. A clever trick you can do with cache record when you're recording conferences or interviews is if you have the cache record at, let's say, 10 seconds, something like that, and you're doing an interview, you're shooting an interview, and you want the entire interview, because you never know when the person you're interviewing is going to say that golden line that you want, that one nugget of absolute gold that's going to go in the video. But at the same time, you don't want a 2-hour-long clip. It's a horrible thing to have to work with in post, a clip that is that long. If you stop recording, start recording again, provided you stop and then start again in less time than the cache is long, you can put all of those different clips together in your timeline in post-production, and there won't be a gap because the cache record fills in the gaps. So you can break up an interview into chunks. So each time a question is asked, while the question is being asked, you can stop and start again, and you won't lose anything. You'll still have the question being asked and everything else. You can put everything together again seamlessly in post-production, but each question will be a separate clip, or each answer would be a separate clip. Same if you're doing a conference. You might have to, for various reasons, have the entire conference from beginning to end. It might be some bloke talking about cameras that waffles on forever, and you might need it all in one take, but you can break it up into separate bits as maybe he does different sections, different topics, different subjects, just by stopping and starting again within the period, within the cache period. So it's quite a useful function. I use it a lot for shooting lightning and thunderstorms and stuff like that, because I can point the camera at the storm, get my deck chair out and a beer, and I can just sit back and enjoy my beer. Lightning flashes, oh, there's lightning, got it. Instead of having to go through hours and hours of footage later on. And then, of course, the other stunt mode is S and Q, which generally most people have assigned to a button on the camera. I can press the button, and we go into slow and quick motion. Wonderful naming that Sony gives some of these things, but there we go. But of course, slow and quick motion, press and hold the button, and I can change the settings. Is not just faster, but we can go slower as well. And now, I was talking to somebody, and I don't think this entirely surprised me, but I was surprised at the level of detail of this. I did an event recently called Wildscreen in the UK in Bristol, which is a regular festival for natural history filmmakers. And I was talking to a guy from the BBC Natural History Unit, and we were talking about S&Q, and he's saying, oh, S&Q, brilliant. He said, elephants, they are 20 frames per second. Tigers, elephants are 30 frames per second. Tigers, lions, stuff like that, they're 35 frames per second. And he produces this list on his phone of different frame rates for different animals. Because you want to make an elephant look really majestic and big, well, if you slow it down ever such a little bit, it looks bigger. If you take a lion and you speed it up just a little bit, it's a bit more menacing and a bit more scary. So they have different frame rates that they use for different animals. And they would use S&Q motion to achieve that. I was quite surprised. Oh, okay, I thought you just shot them and did it. Nope, it's all done in camera. So if you want to make your girlfriend a bit more scary, you could always shoot her at a slightly higher frame rate And if you want her to if you're shooting that romantic, more gentle scene, maybe you shoot it shoot it at a higher frame rate for romantic, lower frame rate for scary, because you speed her up by shooting her at a lower frame rate, and you'll make her go a bit slower by shooting her at a high frame rate. And this could go into a very difficult, dangerous direction, couldn't it? Speeding things up and slowing things down. But it is a really useful function, and again, you can mix this with that slow shutter. Now, actually, here we go. Let's do something here. So let's say I want to do, for some reason, I've decided I want to shoot something and really speed it up, but I don't want to use interval record. And there might be reasons for doing that, and one of them is actually when I want to do a time lapse of a thunderstorm, because see, thunderstorms, you have lightning, flash, flash, flash. Now, a bolt of lightning takes an incredibly short amount of time, less than a frame generally. If I'm using interval record, and I've got a 1 second interval, and I've got a 1/50th shutter, I can guarantee you I'm going to miss every single bolt of lightning in that thunderstorm. And it will just be a cloud going across the sky. And you get back and you look at the footage and think, I'm sure there was lightning in that storm. But if I use S&Q motion at 1 frame per second, and then I go into my camera's main menu, and back button, in shooting and shutter, if I use, instead of speed, I use angle, and I set it to 360 degrees, or I could use speed and turn the shutter off, go off. My shutter is now open for the entire length of each frame. Now I'll have to use the ND filter because obviously it's going to be a very bright exposure, but because the shutter is open for the entire frame and then the camera takes the next frame, I will get all those bolts of lightning in the thunderstorm. I won't miss any. So there are sometimes reasons why you may want to use S&Q motion to speed things up. And again, this is a 1 second long exposure. So if I was doing cars going down the road at night, I'd have 1 second long exposure for each frame. That you'd actually have much more flow in this than if you tried to use interval record. Because if you use interval record, let's say we're doing a 1 second exposure, none of the slow shutter frames come to exactly 1 second. You've got 16 frames. If you're shooting at 25 frames per second, you'd want 25 frames, but there is no 25 frame setting. So you can never get that entire frame as an exposure. You can have longer, which then ends up with a juddery time lapse, or you can have shorter, which is kind of like having a 180-degree shutter with time lapse when actually that's not what you want. You want the shutter open for the entire frame. So this method allows you to have the shutter open for the entire length of every single frame, and you get lovely, smooth, blurry motion. So that might be one reason why you do that. At the other extreme, of course, we can go up to 100 frames or 120 frames per second. Now I need to take the ND out. And again, this might be one of those places where you want to turn the shutter off or use a 360-degree shutter, because you might be struggling for light. If I was to try and use a 180-degree shutter now, 240, 250. I've got enough. I'm in high base and everything else. I can open this lens up because it's 2.8. I could shoot like that, but very often if you don't have a lot of light, if you're trying to do slow motion at night, then you might want to have a 360-degree shutter or turn the shutter off at 120 frames per second. And it won't look wrong because you haven't got a 180-degree shutter. It'll look fine because a 1/120th shutter is quite a quick shutter. So you need to really think a little bit about shutter speed. What do you need as opposed to what do you feel you should have just because somebody on the internet said it's always got to be 180 degrees. It doesn't have to always be 180 degrees at all. Just try and think sensibly about shutter speeds. And the other thing that happens is the higher or the faster your shutter speed, the further you go out of sync with any lighting. And an important consideration here is actually So the camera's set to 120 frames per second, but if we look at what we're outputting, which is based on the base frame rate or your project settings, so my base setting or my record format setting is 25 frames per second. So we're outputting at 25 frames per second, but we're capturing at 120. So 95 frames out of a second, we're not actually seeing on the monitor. And that's where all your flicker's going on and all sorts of nastiness happening. And it's not until you play the clip back in post-production that suddenly there's this dark band rolling down the shot. And it's like, where the f did that come from? Because I didn't see it in the viewfinder when I shot. So whenever you're shooting S&Q motion using high frame rates, it's a really, really good idea to shoot a sample clip and have a look. Play it back before you carry on. Because you might need to think, well, actually, do I need to come down from 120 to 100 frames per second? In Europe, we have 50 hertz mains frequency. Fluorescent lights, like these up here, tube lights, they flash twice in each mains cycle. So a sine wave, mains does that, goes up and down, up and down. And these flash each time that cycle goes through 0. And it goes through 0 twice in every cycle of the mains frequency. So we have 50 hertz mains, so these lights flash 100 times a second. And actually with a tube light, they'll flash from one end as it goes through the negative side and the other end at the positive side. So they go flash, 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 assuming they're working properly. If you're at 120 frames per second, you've got to use a 1/20th or faster shutter. Your shutter speed is now open for less than the cycle of these lights. So one frame will have a flash in it, or possibly even 2 flashes in it, and the next frame won't. And you play it back in post-production and it flickers and it's horrible. But when you're shooting, you're only seeing 1 in 4 frames. Now, if you think about it, it's going bright frame, dark frame, bright frame, dark frame. 1 in 4 frames, you'll only ever see the bright frames. You won't ever see the dark ones. So you won't see the flicker when you're shooting. So the considerations with this are, in Europe, a lot of the time you might not be able to go faster than 120 frames per second if you've got fluorescent lights or any light that is tied to the mains frequency, because you want to keep your shutter speed as close to 100 or 1/100th of a second as you can. The moment you go over 1/100th of a second, there's a high risk of flicker if you have fluorescent lights or a lot of cheaper office lights. So perhaps 120 isn't always going to be the best thing. Yeah.
Is that the same way on a car with LED lights?
No, car lights just vary so much as, God knows what rates they're going at. They're just all over the place. Yeah. And I hate it because now you can't shoot, especially tail lights of cars anymore. They just, and it doesn't matter what you do. That's a slower shutter speed might help you, but you're not going to know until you get the camera in front of the car that you're shooting as to what's going to work with that car. And it varies as well, because the cars actually deliberately do that with the lights because they're actually checking whether the bulb is present and working. So by turning it on and off, they can measure the current change, and they can determine whether your lights are working or not, and all sorts of other stuff. It's a nightmare. Not much we can do about that. If you go to the States, of course, 60 hertz mains, you can use 120 frames per second, 360-degree shutter, and not have flicker. If the lights aren't working very well, then you might find you can't even have a 100th shutter. You might have to drop down to 1/50th shutter, and that's going to limit your high frame rate. And this isn't a camera issue, it is a lighting issue. It's a problem with the lights. Most video lights, they flash so fast, they're 20 kilohertz generally, or faster. You won't have a problem with most video lights. But with ordinary office lighting, trying to shoot, and street lighting, even LED street lighting is tied to the mains frequency and it flickers. So if you shoot anything outside at night under street lighting, do a test shot and play it back, because it's not until you play it back that you'll actually know whether you've got flicker in your shot or not. So many times I've seen people that shoot stuff and it's not until they get into the edit suite and the grading suite and it's like, oh my God, what's happened? And if you do get in that situation, what you do is you simply speed the clip. If you speed the clip up ×2, you drop every other frame and then the flicker goes away again. But you've lost your slow motion. So yeah, there are tools around it. So that's just something to be aware of with higher frame rates and shutter speeds and things like that. And the further you go, so if you go to 240 frames per second, you will have your risk of having flicker in your shots is significantly greater than it would be at a 1/100th shutter. And the higher and higher you go with your shutter speed, the worse that risk becomes. With LED lights, I've even seen with very fast shutter speeds where somebody was doing some 240 frames per second, shooting with 180-degree shutter, their shutter was 1/500th of a second, that they were getting to the point where you could actually see the flicker from the high-frequency LED lights as pairs of lines being slightly brighter than the next pair of line through the image. And it's a really weird look, really odd look. Because it was difficult to identify what was going on. So very, very fast shutter speeds generally will give you more and more and more problems as you go up in shutter speed. Okay, so I think I've run out of time. Questions. I will take some questions before I finish up. No questions. You're all just glad to get out of here, aren't you? Yes.
That was regarding the cache recording.
Yes. No. If it uses any extra, the extra amount is so small that I've not been able to measure it. I mean, the most of this processing in this camera is running all of the time, and it doesn't make much difference when you turn all of these functions on and off. There might be a difference, but it's very, very small. Yep.
The white clip in S-Log.
Yes, 92% for luminance.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's just.
In Cine mode, what is the
Same.
same?
Yeah, the S-Log 3 curve clips at 92%, regardless of how you use it. Yeah, S-Log 3, yes. And that's,
It's 100 or
generally it's 109%.
in 709.
It's 709, yes. Not 100%, it's 709. It's 109.
And also in hypergamma.
The hypergammas depend on the gamma curve that you're using. So if you look on the FX9, the gamma curve will be described as something like HG4, I can't remember how it's written now, HG4 390 or something like that. Where have I got an example of it? The G number, you got a G followed by 2 digits, that's middle gray. So that's where your middle gray exposure should be. And then it will either be, then you'll have a number that will either be like a 460 or 469. If it's 460, it's 460% dynamic range compared to Rec 709, recording to 100%. If it's 469, or the last digit is a 9, then it means it records to 109%. So if the last digit is a 0, it's 100%. If the last digit is a 9, it's 109%. So you've got a couple of curves. You've got that are basically G40, 460, and then one is a 9 and one is a 0. They're the same curve, just within slightly different ranges. Okay. Any more questions?
Yes, another question. Why in the slow motion mode we losing the autofocus like on a square 100, 150, multiple of 50? How come when it doesn't work like in 120?
Okay, I suspect that is because the autofocus operates at the base frame rate. So what you got to think about is a lot of the processing, everything we do, when we output, we're outputting in 25 frames per second. So everything's happening at all the autofocus and things like that are probably happening at 25 frames per second. If you're using 120, well, the maths doesn't work. 120 into 25 doesn't work nicely. And it's probably something related to that. It's probably because unless the frame rate that you're recording at is a direct multiple of the frame rate that the sensor is operating is a direct multiple of the frame rate that you're recording at, because don't forget when or the base rate, that it can't do the maths for the autofocus, that it has to be a direct multiple. It won't be Sony putting in a restriction for some random reason just to piss us off. There will be a proper engineering reason behind it, and it is probably something like that.
Sometimes it works, like 120, you could walk for a bit and then it just goes off. I tried it, sometimes it works a bit.
I
And then it just,
can't say I've noticed that. Generally, if it's a multiple of your base rate, then you're okay. Yeah. Any more questions? Well, don't disappear and go away just because I'm not doing any more talking. There's going to be lots of interesting stuff this afternoon. And of course, all the cameras are here to play with and the lenses and everything else. So there's lots to still to see and do. But thank you for coming.
Så der er frokost, og det er sandwich, og det står selvfølgelig derude, hvor kaffen var før. Og velbekomme.